The metallic ping of a wrench against an old engine block echoed through Oak Ridge Automotive, cutting through the midday heat like a bell announcing the hour. Mike Foster slid out from beneath a rusted Ford F-150, his weathered hands blackened with grease that no amount of industrial soap would fully remove. At 55, Mike's face carried the map of a lifetime spent beneath car hoods. Crow's feet from squinting at stubborn bolts, a permanent furrow between his brows, from decades of mechanical puzzles solved through persistence rather than fancy diagnostics. Damn vacuum line, he muttered, wiping his hands on a rag that had long ago surrendered its original color to engine oil and brake fluid. The radio in the corner crackled with an old Johnny Cash tune, the kind that reminded Mike of riding in his father's truck as a boy back when cars were meant to be fixed by the men who drove them. He reached for his coffee, black cold and forgotten hours ago, when a sound stopped him mid-motion. It was the distinctive high-pitched whine of ceramic brake pads worn down to metal, scraping against rotors that were crying out for mercy. The sound was unmistakable to anyone who'd spent their life around cars, but what made Mike pause wasn't the sound itself. It was the engine purr that accompanied it, too refined, too perfect to belong in this dusty corner of Oak Ridge, Texas. The vehicle slowed and turned into his lot gravel, crunching beneath tires that cost more than most monthly mortgages in town. A Bentley Continental GT in obsidian black, gleaming under the Texas sun like a panther that had somehow wandered into a yard of domesticated cats. Mike stood straightening his back with the careful movement of a man who knew exactly which vertebrae would protest. The Bentley came to a stop, its wheels shuddering slightly, as the driver applied the brakes, sending another screech into the still afternoon air. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered to himself. "Somebody's been driving that machine like they stole it." The driver's door opened with a soft click that spoke of precision engineering. Out stepped a woman who seemed as out of place in his garage as the Bentley itself. She wore tailored gray slacks, a white silk blouse, and shoes with red soles that Mike recognized only because his daughter had once pointed them out in a magazine, explaining they cost more than his monthly rent. Her silver-streaked dark hair was pulled back in a simple yet elegant knot, and her posture spoke of someone accustomed to being noticed without having to demand attention. Elizabeth Montgomery. He didn't need an introduction to recognize the daughter of William Montgomery, whose oil company employed half the county. The Montgomerys owned enough land to qualify as a small nation and had the kind of wealth that meant they never had to introduce themselves. What they didn't have was any business bringing a car like that to Oak Ridge Automotive instead of the dealership in Austin. She removed her sunglasses and looked directly at him, steel gray eyes assessing him with the same careful attention he'd just given her car. "Your brake pads are shot," Mike said before she could speak, pointing toward the front wheel. "Left side's worse than the right. Could hear you coming 2 blocks away." Something flickered across her face, surprise perhaps, or amusement. "That obvious, is it?" "To anyone with ears," Mike replied, his voice neither deferential nor rude. Just matter of fact, the way he'd talk to any customer who rolled in with a problem he could fix. "Can you repair it?" she asked, her tone suggesting she already knew the answer, but was testing him somehow. Mike walked toward the car, running a practiced eye over the sleek lines. "I can look at it. Need to get it up on the lift." He paused, considering something. "Don't usually see these outside the dealership service department. I've had it in 3 different dealerships. None of them spotted the rotor imbalance I suspect is the underlying issue." Her words were precise, educated. Not the kind of mechanical knowledge you'd expect from someone wearing shoes that cost more than most diagnostic computers. Mike raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite himself. "Rotor imbalance, huh? Most folks just say, it makes a funny noise when I stop." "I'm not most folks, Mr. Foster." That caught him off guard. "You know my name. Your reputation, actually." She gestured toward the car. "May I?" He nodded and she opened the passenger door, reaching inside to retrieve a slim leather portfolio. She handed him a business card, heavy stock, with raised lettering in a simple, elegant font. "Elizabeth Montgomery, Chief Investment Officer, Montgomery Holdings." She closed the portfolio. "And yes, I know who repairs vintage cars properly in a 50-mile radius. You rebuilt Jack Miller's '67 Mustang last year, the one that took first place at the Hill Country Classic." Mike took the card, not bothering to glance at it before slipping it into his shirt pocket. The Mustang was straightforward. This, he nodded toward the Bentley, is a different animal altogether. Which is precisely why I'm here instead of at the dealership. She handed him the key fob. How long will it take? To diagnose an hour. To fix depends what I find. She checked her watch. I'll wait. Mike hadn't expected that either. People who drove cars like this usually dropped them off expecting them to be ready when they deigned to return. They didn't wait in grimy garages with plastic chairs and coffee that had been sitting on the burner since sunrise. Suit yourself, he said, gesturing toward the small waiting area. There's coffee if you want it, though I wouldn't recommend it. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. I'm sure I've had worse. As Mike guided the Bentley onto the lift, he couldn't shake the feeling that Elizabeth Montgomery hadn't just happened upon his garage because of brake trouble. The way she watched him, steady, analytical, made him think she was looking for something more than just a mechanic. An hour later, with the Bentley's wheel assembly laid out in precise order on a clean shop cloth, Mike's suspicions were confirmed. The brake pads were indeed worn to the backing plates, but that wasn't the real problem. The calipers showed signs of uneven pressure distribution, something that 3 dealerships should have spotted immediately. Whoever set this up didn't account for the modifications to the suspension, he said without looking up, knowing she was standing just behind him. She'd abandoned the waiting area 15 minutes after he'd started work, silently observing his methodical inspection. What modifications? She asked, and there was something in her voice. Anticipation, perhaps. Mike pointed to the barely perceptible differences in the brake lines. Someone's adjusted the brake bias, shifted it more toward the rear than factory specs. Makes for more aggressive cornering if you know what you're doing. Also makes for uneven pad wear if you don't compensate elsewhere. Interesting, she said softly. How long would it take you to spot that on a car you've never seen before? Mike finally turned to look at her. About 30 seconds if I'm listening right. The sound tells you where to look first. Elizabeth's expression changed, then a slow smile spreading across her face like sunrise breaking over the horizon. Fascinating, Mr. Foster. Not everyone can hear what's wrong before they even look. And in that moment, Mike Foster knew with absolute certainty that Elizabeth Montgomery hadn't come to his garage because of failing brake pads. She'd come looking for something else entirely, or someone. And judging by the look in her eyes, she'd found exactly what she was searching for. Mike worked on the Bentley with the focused precision that had become his signature over 35 years of turning wrenches. His movements were economical, methodical, each tool selected with the certainty of a surgeon choosing an instrument. The Continental GT wasn't just any luxury car. It was a masterpiece of engineering, a 6.0-liter W12 twin-turbocharged engine producing 626 horsepower, nestled in a chassis designed to balance performance and comfort in equal measure. You mind if I ask why you'd modify a setup like this? Mike asked as he carefully removed the caliper mounting bracket. Factory already spent millions getting the balance just right. Elizabeth stood with her arms crossed, watching him work. She'd rolled up the sleeves of her blouse, revealing a slim gold watch that probably cost more than most cars in Mike's garage. I didn't, she replied. The car was a gift from my father. Mike nodded, understanding dawning. And you think he had it modified? I know he did. He believes women can't handle high-performance vehicles in their original state. A touch of bitterness colored her words. He's been adjusting my cars since I got my license at 16. Mike grunted, reaching for his caliper spreader tool. No offense to your father, but that's horse shit. Some of the best drivers I've ever known were women. My daughter can outrace most men on a closed track, and she learned on a '78 Camaro with no power steering. A genuine smile flashed across Elizabeth's face, transforming her from merely elegant to truly beautiful. I'd like to meet your daughter someday. She's in Nashville now, engineering degree. Works for Nissan designing drive systems. The pride in Mike's voice was unmistakable. He turned his attention back to the brakes, fishing in his toolbox for a specialized wrench designed for European brake systems. The good news is these rotors can be salvaged. They're glazed but not warped. I'll need to resurface them. He paused, considering. I've got a set of ceramic pads that'll work better with the way this car's been set up. Not factory, but they'll last longer and give you better stopping power. How long will that take? Elizabeth asked. 2 hours, give or take. Need to machine those rotors proper. She nodded. Do it. Mike raised an eyebrow at the easy acquiescence. Not cheap. Parts alone will run close to $1,000. Elizabeth waved her hand dismissively. Price isn't my concern. Quality is. Fair enough. Mike began setting up his brake lathe, a piece of equipment that cost more than some used cars. It was one of his few concessions to modern technology. German-made, computer-calibrated, capable of resurfacing rotors to within 1/10,000th of an inch of perfect. As he worked, Elizabeth moved around the garage, studying the framed photographs on the walls. Classic restorations Mike had completed over the years. A 1957 Chevy Bel Air candy apple red with chrome that gleamed like liquid silver. A 1969 Dodge Charger midnight black, with a stance that suggested it might leap off its wheels at any moment. A 1965 Shelby Cobra blue with white racing stripes sitting next to a beaming elderly man who looked like he'd just been handed the keys to heaven. You do good work, she said, not looking away from the photos. I do honest work, Mike corrected, fitting the first rotor onto the lathe. There's a difference. The machine hummed to life, its diamond-tipped bits beginning the careful process of removing just enough metal to restore a perfect braking surface without compromising structural integrity. Mike adjusted the settings with practiced ease, watching the digital readout that confirmed what his eyes and hands already told him. You know, Elizabeth said over the sound of the lathe, most mechanics would have recommended replacing these rotors entirely. More expensive, easier, faster. Mike didn't look up from his work. Most mechanics are looking at their bottom line, not what the car needs. These rotors have plenty of life left, just need to be treated right. Like most things worth keeping, she replied softly. When Mike finished with the rotors, he moved on to rebuilding the calipers. His hands worked with practiced efficiency, disassembling, cleaning and replacing seals and hardware, then reassembling each component. The smell of brake cleaner and assembly lubricant filled the air, chemical, yet somehow satisfying. The scent of problems being solved. You've been doing this a long time, Elizabeth observed. Since I was 12, Mike confirmed. Started helping my granddad in his garage. He taught me to diagnose by ear, by feel, said computers were just there to confirm what your senses already told you. Your grandfather sounds like a wise man. He was. Mike's voice held a note of something deeper. Respect, certainly, but also loss. Best damn mechanic in 3 counties. Could rebuild a transmission with nothing but basic tools and sheer stubbornness. Elizabeth seemed to weigh her words carefully before speaking again. What was his name? Joseph, Mike answered, not noticing the slight tension in Elizabeth's posture. Joseph Foster. Most folks called him Joe, or that miracle worker down at Foster's garage. Did he work exclusively on American cars, or? Mike glanced up, finding her gaze oddly intense. Anything with an engine. Had a special touch with older European stuff, though. Said they were built with more personality than American cars. He chuckled. Used to drive my dad crazy when he'd say that. Dad was Chevy through and through. Elizabeth nodded, a strange expression crossing her face. But before Mike could question it, she glanced at her watch and stepped back. I need to make a call, she said. Will you be finished soon? Half-hour tops. She nodded and walked outside, phone already in hand. Through the open garage door, Mike could see her, pacing slowly, her free hand gesturing occasionally as she spoke. Something about her body language suggested the conversation was significant. Her normally perfect posture seemed even more rigid, her movements precise and controlled. By the time she returned, Mike was tightening the last lug nut on the Bentley's wheel. He lowered the car from the lift and wiped his hands on a clean shop rag. All set, he said. Rotors resurfaced, new pads installed, calipers rebuilt and properly balanced. I also adjusted the brake bias back toward factory specs. She'll stop straight as an arrow now. Thank you. Elizabeth reached for her purse, a sleek leather affair that probably cost more than Mike's monthly mortgage payment. How much do I owe you? Mike handed her a handwritten invoice. Parts and labor. She glanced at the total, then back at him. This seems low. It's what the job cost, Mike said with a shrug. I don't charge extra because of the badge on the hood. Elizabeth studied him for a moment, then wrote out a check. When she handed it to him, Mike noticed she'd added $100 to his quoted price. "The extra is for honesty," she said before he could object. "It's a rare commodity these days." Mike pocketed the check without comment, then handed her the keys to the Bentley. "She's ready whenever you are." Elizabeth took the keys but didn't move toward the car immediately. Instead, she reached into her purse and extracted a business card, her own, and wrote something on the back. "My personal number," she said, handing it to him, "in case you ever need to reach me directly." Mike accepted the card with a raised eyebrow. "Planning on having more brake trouble?" "No," Elizabeth said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "But I think our paths will cross again, Mr. Foster. I believe in being prepared." With that cryptic statement, she slid into the driver's seat of the Bentley. The engine purred to life, a controlled rumble of power and precision. As she pulled away, Mike noticed she tested the brakes at the end of the driveway. A quick, firm stop that would demonstrate the improvements he'd made. The car disappeared around the corner, leaving Mike standing in his garage doorway, Elizabeth Montgomery's business card in his hand, and the distinct feeling that this wasn't the end of whatever had just begun. 2 days later, Mike was deep in the bowels of a 1973 International Harvester Scout wrestling with a stubborn transfer case that had decided to weld itself to the transmission after 30 years of faithful service. Sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the industrial fans blowing full blast throughout the garage. August in Texas took no prisoners. The rumble of a powerful engine drew his attention. Not the Bentley this time, but a Lincoln Navigator. Black new model windows, tinted beyond what was strictly legal. It pulled into his lot with deliberate slowness, tires crunching on gravel, before coming to a stop directly in front of the open garage bay. Mike straightened, wiping his hands on a shop rag as the driver's door opened. Elizabeth Montgomery stepped out, her appearance as immaculate as before, though today she wore a simple white blouse and dark jeans that probably cost more than most people's entire wardrobes. She wasn't alone. A tall, distinguished man in his 60s emerged from the passenger side dressed in a light gray suit that looked custom-tailored to his lanky frame. He carried a leather portfolio tucked under one arm and surveyed the garage with the measured assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating assets. "Mr. Foster," Elizabeth called, walking toward him with confident strides. "I hope we're not interrupting." "Just me arguing with 40 years of rust," Mike replied, gesturing toward the Scout. "Might be a welcome break depending on why you're here." "This is Charles Webster," Elizabeth said, indicating her companion. "He's my family's legal counsel." Webster extended a hand. "Mr. Foster, a pleasure." Mike shook it, noting the firm grip and manicured nails. Not sure what legal counsel would want with a mechanic unless that Bentley's brakes failed after all. Elizabeth smiled. "The Bentley is performing beautifully. This is about something else entirely." She glanced around. "Is there somewhere we might sit and talk?" Mike gestured toward his small office. Really just a corner of the garage partitioned off with half walls of glass and aluminum. Inside were a metal desk cluttered with invoices and parts catalogs, 3 mismatched chairs, and a small refrigerator that hummed laboriously in the heat. "Not exactly the Ritz," Mike said as he led them in, "but the coffee's fresh." Webster declined with a polite smile, but Elizabeth accepted a mug. Black, no sugar. She took a sip and nodded appreciatively. "Strong, good." Mike settled into the chair behind his desk, its springs protesting slightly. "So what brings Montgomery Holdings to my doorstep with legal representation in tow?" Webster placed his portfolio on the desk and opened it. "Ms. Montgomery has authorized me to discuss a consulting opportunity with you." "Consulting?" Mike repeated skeptically. Elizabeth leaned forward. "We'd like to hire you for a restoration project, Mr. Foster. One of considerable importance to my family." "I'm a mechanic, not a consultant," Mike said. "And there are restoration specialists in Austin who handle high-end classics. Barrett's over on Jefferson has a 6-month waiting list for good reason." "We've been to Barrett's," Elizabeth replied, "and to Classique Motors in Houston, and to 3 other specialists across the state." Her fingers made air quotes around the word. "None of them could solve our problem." Mike's interest was piqued despite himself. "What kind of car are we talking about?" "A 1938 Packard 12 convertible Victoria," Elizabeth said, watching his reaction closely. Mike let out a low whistle. Model 1607, only made about 20 of them if I recall correctly. 17, Elizabeth corrected, and we have the third one ever built. Webster withdrew several photographs from his portfolio and slid them across the desk. The vehicle has been in the Montgomery family since 1952. It was Mrs. Montgomery's personal car for many years. Mike studied the photos. The Packard was a masterpiece. Long, elegant lines, a massive 12-cylinder engine, the kind of craftsmanship that had disappeared with the post-war boom. But these weren't glamour shots. They were diagnostic photos showing the car in various states of disassembly. The engine compartment was half-emptied components laid out with careful precision. The dashboard had been partially removed, wiring exposed. Someone started a restoration and stopped mid-project, Mike observed. Elizabeth nodded. My father. After my mother died, he decided to restore her favorite car himself. He made it about halfway through before she hesitated. Before he determined it was beyond his capabilities. Mike flipped through more photos. What's the actual problem? Engine won't turn over, electrical system. Shot. That's just it, Elizabeth said, frustration evident in her voice. It should work. Every component has been checked, rebuilt, or replaced. The engine was completely disassembled and restored by one of the best shops in Dallas. The electrical system was rewired to period-correct specifications. The transmission was overhauled by a specialist in Michigan. And yet, Mike prompted, and yet when assembled, it runs for approximately 4 minutes before the engine temperature spikes catastrophically, Webster interjected. No obvious leaks, no visible issues with the cooling system. 6 different experts have examined it, and none can determine the cause. Mike set the photos down and leaned back in his chair. So you want me to diagnose a problem that has stumped 6 specialists with more resources and experience with Packards than I have? Yes, Elizabeth said simply. Why me? Elizabeth's gaze was steady. Because you found a brake bias issue on my Bentley in 30 seconds that 3 dealership technicians missed entirely. Because you chose to resurface rotors instead of replacing them, showing both technical skill and integrity. And because when you work on a car, you don't just see parts, you see the whole system. Mike drummed his fingers on the desk, considering. A Packard 12 is a whole different animal than a modern Bentley. We're talking pre-war engineering components that haven't been manufactured in 80 years. We have all the necessary parts, Webster assured him. A complete inventory was done before the restoration began. Mr. Montgomery was quite thorough in his preparations. I'm sure he was, Mike murmured, still turning the problem over in his mind. Where is the car now? At our family estate, Elizabeth answered. We have a climate-controlled garage facility where the work was being done. Webster reached into his portfolio again and withdrew a formal document. This is our proposed consulting agreement. The terms are quite generous, a substantial retainer access to all necessary resources and complete authority over the restoration process. Mike took the document but didn't open it immediately. Instead, he looked directly at Elizabeth. This is more than just restoring a car, isn't it? There's something you're not telling me. A shadow crossed Elizabeth's face so quickly Mike might have imagined it if he hadn't been watching closely. The car was important to my mother, she said carefully. Very important. Restoring it properly would mean a great deal to our family. Mike studied her for a long moment, then flipped open the agreement. The retainer figure made him blink. It was more than he typically earned in 3 months. The terms were straightforward: full access to the Montgomery Estate Facility's authority to order any parts or tools needed, and complete control over the restoration process. This is generous, he said, understating considerably. We value expertise, Webster replied, and discretion. Mike raised an eyebrow. Discretion, Elizabeth interceded smoothly. My father is a private man, Mr. Foster. He doesn't wish for his personal restoration project to become a topic of conversation among automotive enthusiasts. The car has sentimental value. Mike closed the agreement and tapped it against his desk, thinking. The money was tempting, enough to pay off his outstanding loan on the garage's diagnostic equipment with plenty left over. The challenge was even more enticing. A pre-war Packard 12 with a mysterious ailment that had stumped specialists across the state. That was the kind of puzzle that kept mechanics like him awake at night. I'll take a look, he said finally. No promises beyond that. If I can figure out what's wrong, we can discuss the full restoration. Relief flickered across Elizabeth's face. That's all we're asking for now, Webster nodded approvingly. When could you begin? Mike gestured toward the Scout in his garage bay. I need to finish this job first. Tomorrow afternoon at the earliest. Tomorrow is perfect, Elizabeth said, rising from her chair. Shall we say 1 o'clock at the Montgomery estate? I'll text you the address and gate code. Mike stood as well, extending his hand. 1 o'clock it is. As they shook hands, Elizabeth held his gaze a beat longer than necessary. Thank you, Mr. Foster. This means more than you know. After they departed, Mike returned to the stubborn transfer case, but his mind was elsewhere, on 12 cylinders of American engineering excellence and on the curious intensity in Elizabeth Montgomery's eyes when she spoke of her mother's car. Mike pulled up to a circular driveway where a fountain bubbled cheerfully at its center. He parked beside a row of vehicles that made his truck seem even more out of place. A Range Rover, a Mercedes G-Wagon, and the Bentley Continental GT he'd worked on 2 days prior. Before he could exit his truck, the front door opened and Elizabeth emerged. She'd exchanged yesterday's business casual for riding clothes, jodhpurs boots, and a light blue button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and for the first time since he'd met her, she wore no visible jewelry except a plain watch. Mr. Foster, she called, walking toward him with a warm smile. Right on time. Mike climbed out of his truck, suddenly conscious of his worn jeans and the faded Snap-on Tools t-shirt he'd thrown on that morning. Miss Montgomery. Elizabeth, please, she corrected, extending her hand. We're going to be working together after all. Mike, then, he replied, shaking her hand. Did you have any trouble finding us? Hard to miss the only private road in the county with perfect asphalt, Mike said with a hint of a smile. Elizabeth laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to catch her by surprise. Father has strong opinions about road maintenance. Come, I'll show you to the garage. Rather than leading him toward the main house, she guided him along a stone path that curved around the east wing. I hope you don't mind walking a bit. The automotive collection is housed separately from the main residence. Your father keeps a collection? Mike asked, falling into step beside her. Elizabeth nodded. Nothing extensive, about a dozen vehicles he considers significant, some for their historical value, others for personal reasons. The path wound through a rose garden, the blooms fighting valiantly against the August heat. Beyond it stood a structure that at first glance resembled a barn, cedar-sided with a metal roof patinated to a soft green. But as they approached, Mike could see it was far more sophisticated than any agricultural building. Elizabeth pressed her thumb against a small scanner beside the entrance, then entered a code on a keypad. There was a soft click, and the door swung open to reveal a climate-controlled space about the size of a small airplane hangar. Cool air washed over them as they stepped inside. The lighting was subdued but carefully positioned, illuminating a collection of automobiles that made Mike's breath catch. Each car sat on a section of polished concrete separated from its neighbors by enough space to walk comfortably around it. Most were covered with custom-fitted car covers, but even the shrouded shapes were enough to identify some true classics. Those are just the regular drivers, Elizabeth said, noticing his gaze. Father's actual collection is through here. Elizabeth led him through an impressive collection of classic cars to a separate area at the far end of the building. And here, she said, her voice softening, is my mother's Packard. The car sat beneath harsh work lights, a stark contrast to the gentle illumination of the main collection. Its hood was up the left front wheel, removed tools and parts arranged with methodical precision on nearby workbenches. Unlike the other vehicles in pristine condition, the Packard was clearly mid-restoration. Its once gleaming paint dulled with age chrome pitted in places, leather seats showing cracks like an old man's hands. Yet even in this state, its dignity was undeniable. The 12 convertible Victoria was one of the most elegant automobiles ever produced, a statement of American craftsmanship and engineering prowess that stood toe-to-toe with anything Europe had built. The massive V12 engine was partially disassembled components labeled and arranged on a nearby table. She's been waiting a long time, Elizabeth said quietly. Mike approached the car slowly, almost reverently. How long has the restoration been stalled? 8 years, she replied, since about 2 years after Mother died. Mike nodded, beginning his assessment. He circled the Packard, slowly taking in every detail. The craftsmanship was evident even in its current state. The sweep of the fenders, the perfect proportions, the attention to detail that modern manufacturing had largely abandoned in favor of efficiency. "Your father did good work," he observed, examining the partially restored engine components. "These are period-correct rebuilds, not reproductions." He was meticulous about authenticity, Elizabeth agreed. Sourced original parts whenever possible, had components machined to exact specifications when they couldn't be found. Mike peered into the engine compartment, noting the careful labeling of every wire hose and connection. "And you said it runs for about 4 minutes before overheating." 3 minutes and 42 seconds to be precise, came a deep voice from behind them. "I timed it during the last attempt." Mike turned to find a tall, imposing figure standing at the entrance to the workspace. William Montgomery was in his late 60s, with silver hair, cut military short, and the erect posture of someone accustomed to command. He wore pressed khakis and a blue Oxford shirt, with the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with the kind of strength that came from actual work, not just gym memberships. His face might have been handsome if not for the hard set of his jaw and the coldness in his blue eyes. "Father," Elizabeth said, an edge of surprise in her voice. "I didn't expect you to join us." "Clearly," Montgomery replied, his gaze fixed on Mike. "Mr. Foster, I presume." Mike straightened, meeting the older man's stare directly. "Mr. Montgomery, Elizabeth seems to think you can succeed where 6 specialists have failed." There was no question in his statement, just cool assessment. "I don't know that yet," Mike answered honestly, "but I'm willing to take a look." Montgomery's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Not warming exactly, but perhaps a fractional reduction in hostility. "At considerable expense to me." "Father," Elizabeth began, a warning in her tone. Mike held up a hand. "It's a fair point. You're paying good money for my opinion, Mr. Montgomery. I'll give you an honest assessment. If I can't help, I'll tell you straight and only charge for my time today." Montgomery regarded him silently for a moment, then gave a curt nod. "Acceptable." He turned to his daughter. "The Webster contracts arrived for review. I need you in the study." It wasn't a request. Elizabeth glanced at Mike apologetically. "I'll be back shortly. Make yourself at home with the Packard." As they departed, Mike noticed the stiffness in Elizabeth's shoulders, the way she walked a half step behind her father, rather than beside him. Family dynamics were none of his business, but it was clear that William Montgomery was accustomed to control, and equally clear that Elizabeth chafed under it. Once alone, Mike turned his full attention to the Packard. He pulled a small flashlight from his pocket and began a methodical examination of the engine compartment, tracing coolant lines, inspecting hose connections, checking the water pump for signs of impeller damage. Everything appeared to be in excellent condition, restored with care and genuine expertise. After 30 minutes of careful inspection, he moved to the workbench where the engine components had been laid out. Each part was meticulously labeled many, accompanied by detailed notes about restoration work already completed. The attention to detail was impressive, suggesting that William Montgomery was not just a wealthy collector, but a true enthusiast with substantial mechanical knowledge. Mike was examining the cylinder head when he heard footsteps approaching. Elizabeth returned now, carrying 2 bottles of water. She handed one to Mike. "Sorry about that," she said. "Business never stops, apparently, even for automotive mysteries." "No problem," Mike replied, accepting the water gratefully. "Gives me time to get acquainted with the patient." Elizabeth smiled at his choice of words. "And what's your initial diagnosis, doctor?" "Still gathering symptoms," Mike said, taking a long drink. "But I can tell you this, your father knows his way around an engine. This restoration work is top-notch." "He used to restore cars as a hobby when I was young," Elizabeth said, perching on a nearby stool, "before the business demanded all his time. This was supposed to be his return to that passion." Mike nodded, turning back to the Packard. "Tell me exactly what happens when it overheats. Any warning signs, noises, smells?" "It starts perfectly," Elizabeth said. "Runs smoothly, idles beautifully. Then around the 3-minute mark, the temperature gauge begins to climb rapidly. No unusual sounds, no visible leaks, no steam from the radiator. It just gets hot, dangerously hot, as if the cooling system isn't functioning at all." "But the water pump turns the coolant flows," Mike mused. "Has anyone pressure tested the entire cooling system?" Twice, Elizabeth confirmed. No leaks internal or external. Mike frowned, considering the problem. Mind if I look at the documentation, service records, restoration notes, anything from when your mother was driving it regularly? Of course. Elizabeth moved to a filing cabinet in the corner and withdrew a thick binder. Father documented everything. The original purchase in '52, all service records, the complete restoration plan. Mike accepted the binder and began leafing through it. The documentation was indeed comprehensive. Meticulous records spanning decades, each service documented with dates, mileage, work performed, and parts replaced. As he flipped through the earlier pages, something caught his eye. A notation from 1968. Complete cooling system overhaul. Custom modifications to improve flow rate. Work performed by J. Foster. Mike's hand froze on the page. J. Foster. The coincidence was too precise to be accidental. Joseph Foster, his grandfather, had worked on this very car. Mr. Foster, Elizabeth's voice broke through his shock. You found something. Mike looked up, trying to keep his expression neutral. Maybe. Do you have any records about modifications made to the cooling system in the late '60s? Elizabeth frowned slightly. I don't recall anything specific. Why? Mike hesitated, then decided on directness. Because it appears my grandfather may have worked on this car in 1968. Elizabeth's reaction was almost imperceptible. A slight widening of the eyes, a barely noticeable intake of breath. But it was enough to confirm Mike's growing suspicion that this coincidence was anything but. Your grandfather, she repeated, her tone carefully controlled. Joseph Foster, Mike said, watching her closely. The entry here shows he performed a complete cooling system overhaul with custom modifications in 1968. Elizabeth extended her hand for the binder. Mike passed it to her, and she studied the entry with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to a half-century-old service record. I had no idea, she said finally, but something in her voice rang false. Didn't you? Mike asked quietly. You knew my name before you brought the Bentley to my garage. You specifically sought me out. Elizabeth met his gaze, her expression now unreadable. I told you, your reputation preceded you. The work on Jack Miller's Mustang was exceptional. There are dozens of good mechanics between here and Austin, Mike countered, but you brought a Bentley with brake issues to a small-town garage, then hired me to look at a Packard that your father has spent years trying to restore. He gestured to the binder, a Packard that my grandfather modified over 50 years ago. The silence between them stretched taut as piano wire. Finally, Elizabeth sighed, her shoulders dropping slightly. We should talk, she said. But not here. Father has cameras in all the garages. Of course he does, Mike muttered. Elizabeth stood. Let me show you the rest of the collection. We can discuss the Packard's history somewhere more private. As they walked away from the workspace, Mike cast one last glance at the elegant machine. What had been a fascinating mechanical puzzle had just become something far more complex and potentially troubling. Whatever connection existed between the Montgomerys, the Packard, and his grandfather, Mike, had the distinct feeling he was being drawn into a story that had begun long before he arrived at this immaculate garage. The sunlight was beginning its late afternoon slant when Elizabeth led Mike to a small gazebo nestled within one of the estate's formal gardens. Far enough from the main house and garage buildings to ensure privacy, it offered a perfect vantage point for watching the Texas sunset while remaining shielded from the August heat. We won't be disturbed here, Elizabeth said, settling onto a bench. Father never comes to the gardens. They were Mother's domain. Mike remained standing, arms crossed. I think it's time you told me what's really going on, why you sought me out specifically. Elizabeth studied him for a long moment, as if weighing exactly how much to reveal. It wasn't just your work on the Mustang, she admitted finally, though that did confirm what I already suspected, that you inherited your grandfather's talent. How do you know about my grandfather? Mike pressed. Because my mother kept a journal, Elizabeth replied. Several, actually. I found them after her death, hidden in a compartment behind her dressing room wall. She paused, choosing her words carefully. They contained detailed accounts of her life, including her friendship with a mechanic named Joseph Foster. Friendship, Mike repeated the word, hanging between them like a question. Elizabeth met his gaze directly. At minimum, the journals aren't entirely clear on the exact nature of their relationship. Mike processed this, trying to reconcile this revelation with what he knew of his grandfather, a quiet, hardworking man who'd run a respected garage until his retirement in the early 80s. Joseph had died when Mike was 19, taking whatever secrets he might have had to the grave. "Why would your mother hide journals about a friendship with a mechanic?" he asked. "Because my father would have destroyed them," Elizabeth said simply. "William Montgomery doesn't tolerate what he considers disloyalty, in business or in personal matters." Mike frowned. "And your mother's friendship with my grandfather would have qualified as disloyalty?" "In his eyes, absolutely." Elizabeth gestured for Mike to sit. After a moment's hesitation, he joined her on the bench. "You have to understand the context. My parents' marriage was essentially a merger between two wealthy Texas families. Emotional compatibility was never a consideration." "Sounds romantic," Mike said dryly. A fleeting smile crossed Elizabeth's face. "Hardly. Mother came from oil money, old Texas wealth. Father was new money, energy development, land acquisition, the beginnings of what would become Montgomery Holdings. Their union was financially advantageous to both families." "And where does my grandfather fit into this corporate love story?" Elizabeth leaned back slightly, her gaze distant. "Mother loved cars, not as status symbols, but for what they were, marvels of engineering, expressions of freedom. The Packard was her escape. Father allowed it because it was appropriately prestigious, but he insisted it be maintained by professionals at authorized service centers." "Let me guess," Mike interjected. "Those professionals couldn't keep it running properly." Elizabeth nodded. "The Packard developed cooling issues in the late 60s. After 3 failed attempts to fix it at the dealership, Mother took matters into her own hands. She drove to a small garage she'd heard about from one of the stable hands, Foster's Garage in Oak Ridge." Mike felt a strange tightening in his chest. This was a part of his family history he'd never heard, a connection to his grandfather's life that had somehow remained hidden for decades. "According to her journals," Elizabeth continued, "Joseph Foster diagnosed the problem in minutes. Something about the way the water pump had been installed during the previous service. He not only fixed it, but made improvements to the entire cooling system. Modifications that made the car run better than it had since my parents acquired it. And after that, Mother brought all her car troubles to your grandfather. It became her ritual, driving the Packard to Oak Ridge once a month supposedly for regular maintenance." Elizabeth's voice softened. "The journals suggest those visits became the highlight of her life. Joseph would work on the car and they would talk about engineering, about books, about places they'd never seen but wanted to visit someday." Mike tried to picture it, his quiet, reserved grandfather forming an unlikely friendship with a wealthy woman from one of Texas's prominent families. It seemed improbable, yet somehow fitting. Joseph had always had a gift for putting people at ease, for treating everyone who walked into his garage with the same straightforward respect, regardless of their station. "These monthly visits," Mike said carefully. "How long did they continue?" "Almost 2 years," Elizabeth replied. "Then they stopped abruptly in late 1969. Mother's journals become fragmented after that. Entries are sporadic, often just a few lines. But it's clear something happened. Something that changed everything." Mike absorbed this, mentally calculating. "I was born in '69, he said quietly. "December." Elizabeth met his gaze, and in her eyes Mike saw the real reason she had sought him out. "Yes," she said simply, "you were." The implication hung in the air between them, neither willing to voice it directly. Mike stood suddenly, pacing the small confines of the gazebo. "This is why you brought me here. Not because of my work on the Mustang or the Bentley's brakes. You think—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "I don't know what to think," Elizabeth said. "But when I found those journals, when I saw your name in the local paper after the classic car show last year, I knew I had to find out. And the Packard, the restoration problem, that's real," Elizabeth assured him. "After Mother died, Father decided to restore her car himself. I believe it was his way of reclaiming it somehow, making it his rather than hers. But he hit a wall. The cooling system refused to function properly despite every expert he consulted. Because of my grandfather's modifications," Mike concluded. Elizabeth nodded. "That's my theory. Joseph Foster made changes to that car that no one else has been able to fully understand or replicate, not even father with all his resources. Mike ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. This is a lot to process. I know, Elizabeth said softly, and I apologize for not being forthright from the beginning, but I wasn't sure how to approach you with such a delicate possibility. Mike looked back toward the garage where the Packard waited like a mechanical Rosetta Stone, potentially holding the key to a family secret buried for over half a century. I need to see the journals, he said finally. Elizabeth hesitated. They're intensely personal. Mother's private thoughts. I'm not asking to read every entry, Mike clarified. Just the parts about my grandfather and the work he did on the Packard. If I'm going to solve the cooling issue, I need to understand his modifications. After a moment's consideration, Elizabeth nodded. That's fair. I'll get them for you tomorrow. Mike checked his watch. It was approaching 6 o'clock. I should go. I need time to think about all this. Of course, Elizabeth stood. Will you come back to work on the Packard? Mike studied her face, the same steel gray eyes that had assessed him so carefully in his garage just days ago, now revealing an unexpected vulnerability. Whatever her motives in bringing him here, she genuinely wanted that car restored. And despite the bombshell she just dropped, he found himself intrigued by the mechanical puzzle it presented. I'll be back, he said finally. 8 o'clock tomorrow. Bring those journals and any technical documents you can find related to the cooling system. Relief washed over Elizabeth's features. Thank you. As they walked back toward the main house, Mike found himself stealing glances at her profile, searching for any resemblance to himself or his family. It was impossible to tell. The Montgomery genes were clearly dominant in her appearance. At his truck, Elizabeth extended her hand. Until tomorrow, then. Mike shook it, noting the firmness of her grip, not unlike his own. Tomorrow. As he drove down the immaculate private road toward the highway, his mind raced with questions. Was it possible could Elizabeth Montgomery, heiress to one of the largest private fortunes in Texas, be his half-sister? And if so, what did that mean for him? For her, for the carefully constructed narratives both their families had built over decades, the Packard's mechanical mystery now seemed almost secondary to the human one unfolding around it. Yet somehow Mike suspected that solving one might be the key to unlocking the other. The sun was setting as he turned onto the main highway, casting long shadows across the landscape. Somewhere behind him on that manicured estate sat a machine that connected his family to the Montgomerys in ways he was only beginning to understand. A 12-cylinder enigma that might hold the answers to questions he hadn't known to ask until today. Dawn had barely broken when Mike pulled into the Montgomery estate the next morning, dew still clinging to the manicured lawns. He'd slept poorly, his mind churning with questions about his grandfather, Catherine Montgomery, and the possible connection between their families. By 5 a.m., he'd given up on sleep altogether, choosing instead to head to the estate early and spend some time alone with the Packard before Elizabeth arrived. The security guard at the gate seemed surprised to see him, but waved him through after a quick call to the main house. Mike drove directly to the garage complex using the access code Elizabeth had provided the day before. The climate-controlled space was silent, except for the gentle hum of the air handling system. Mike flipped on the work lights in the Packard section, illuminating the elegant machine in harsh fluorescent clarity. In the quiet of early morning with no one else around, he could almost feel the car's presence, not just as an assembly of metal, rubber, and leather, but as a vessel containing memories, secrets, perhaps even answers. All right, old girl, he murmured, shrugging off his jacket. Let's see what makes you tick. Mike began a thorough examination and discovered an unusual component in the cooling system, a specially designed hollow bolt. Elizabeth nodded. Tell me what you need. For the next 2 hours, they worked side by side, Elizabeth proving surprisingly knowledgeable about tools and mechanical processes. She anticipated his needs, handing him wrenches and sockets before he asked for them, holding parts steady as he loosened connections, even suggesting approaches when conventional methods proved difficult due to the Packard's unique design. You know your way around an engine, Mike observed as she deftly disconnected a stubborn hose clamp. A faint smile touched her lips. Father insisted I learn the basics, said no Montgomery should ever be at the mercy of a mechanic. She glanced at him. No offense intended. None taken, Mike replied. It's good advice. Cars aren't mystical beasts, just complicated machines. Understanding them means you can't be taken advantage of. That was essentially his argument, though I suspect his motives had more to do with control than consumer protection. She paused, her expression growing thoughtful. Mother encouraged it, though, said working with my hands would teach me patience and problem solving better than any business school. Mike nodded, remembering his own father's similar philosophy. Smart woman. She was, Elizabeth agreed softly. With the water pump finally removed, Mike's discovery was confirmed. The small channel in the engine block connected to a secondary cooling passage, one that wouldn't be apparent unless you knew exactly where to look. Your grandfather created a dual cooling circuit, Mike explained, pointing out the modification. The main system works as designed, but this secondary circuit provides additional cooling to specific areas of the engine that were prone to heat buildup in the original design. Would removing this cause the overheating issues father experienced? Almost certainly, Mike confirmed, especially if he was rebuilding according to factory specs without knowing about this modification. Elizabeth frowned. But why would the car run for a few minutes before overheating? Shouldn't problems appear immediately? Good question. Mike studied the system, mentally tracing the flow of coolant. My guess is that the main cooling system works fine at idle or low RPM. It's only when the engine gets fully up to operating temperature and under load that the standard cooling becomes insufficient. He continued his examination, carefully documenting each discovery. As he worked deeper into the engine's cooling passages, he found more evidence of his grandfather's handiwork. Subtle modifications to the thermostat housing a custom-machined water distribution tube inside the block, even alterations to the radiator mounting that improved airflow. Joseph was a genius, Mike murmured almost to himself. These aren't random changes. This is a completely re-engineered cooling system disguised to look factory original. Could you recreate it? Elizabeth asked. Mike nodded slowly. I think so with time. The real question is why your father couldn't. If he was as meticulous as these restoration records suggest, he should have noticed these modifications. Unless he deliberately removed them, Elizabeth said quietly. Mike glanced up sharply. Why would he do that? Elizabeth's expression darkened. Because they were my mother's preferences implemented by a man She stopped, seemingly unwilling to complete the thought. A man she what? Mike prompted. Elizabeth reached for her satchel and withdrew a small, leather-bound book. I brought the journals as promised. This one covers 1968 through early 1970. The entries about your grandfather and the Packard are marked. The final marked entry was dated November 4th, 1969. It must end. William suspects something, though there is nothing to suspect beyond friendship and mechanical instruction. Joseph agrees it's too dangerous to continue our monthly appointments. The risk to his business, his reputation, his family is too great. My heart feels hollowed out at the thought of never again experiencing those hours of simple honesty of being Catherine rather than Mrs. William Montgomery. But he is right as always. Some connections, however innocent in action, carry intentions too powerful to be safely contained. I will miss him terribly. The Packard too, though for different reasons. It was for a brief time my escape. Now it will become merely another possession, a reminder of what cannot be. Mike closed the journal gently, his mind racing. The entries confirmed the connection between his grandfather and Catherine Montgomery, hinted at deeper feelings, but stopped short of confirming any physical relationship. And yet the timing of the final entry, November 1969, just weeks before his own birth in December, felt significant. There's more, Elizabeth said softly, reaching into her satchel again. This was tucked into the back of the journal. I found it after Mother died. She handed him a small, faded photograph. It showed a younger Joseph Foster standing beside the Packard, a smile on his face that Mike had rarely seen in family photos. Unguarded, genuinely happy. Beside him stood a beautiful woman with dark hair and gray eyes that matched Elizabeth's, exactly her hand resting lightly on Joseph's arm in a gesture that spoke of comfortable familiarity. On the back, in the same elegant handwriting as the journal was written, Joseph in the Packard, September 1969, the happiest of afternoons. Mike studied the photo, noting details his trained eye couldn't miss. The slight rounding of Catherine's midsection, carefully disguised by the cut of her dress, but visible to someone looking closely. September 1969, 3 months before his birth. You see it too, Elizabeth said, not a question, but a confirmation. Mike nodded slowly. It suggests possibilities. More than suggests, I think. Elizabeth took back the photo, handling it carefully. There's one more thing you should see. From her satchel, she produced a small metal box, the kind used for storing important documents. Opening it revealed a folded piece of paper that had yellowed slightly with age. She handed it to Mike. It was a birth certificate. His birth certificate. Mother Mary Foster. Father Robert Foster. Everything as he had always known it to be. I don't understand, Mike said, looking us up. This just confirms what I already know about my parents. Look at the attending physician, Elizabeth said quietly. Mike's eyes moved to the signature at the bottom of the form. Dr. Andrew Kelly. The name meant nothing to him. Dr. Kelly was my mother's personal physician, Elizabeth explained. He didn't deliver babies. He was an internist who handled the Montgomery family's medical needs. He had no privileges at Oak Ridge Community Hospital where you were born. Mike frowned. Then why is his signature on my birth certificate? That's what I've been trying to figure out, Elizabeth replied. I found records of substantial payments from my mother's personal account to Dr. Kelly in late 1969 and early 1970, payments that weren't related to any medical treatment she received. The implication hung in the air between them. Mike stared at the birth certificate, the foundation of his identity suddenly shifting beneath him like sand. You think your mother arranged for a false birth certificate, he said finally, that she was my biological mother, not Mary Foster. I think it's a possibility we need to consider, Elizabeth replied carefully. Given the timing, the journal entries, the photograph, and these unusual financial transactions. Mike shook his head, struggling to process the implications. My mother, Mary, never gave any indication. She and my father seemed happily married when I was growing up. There were no secrets, no awkward silences when family history came up. Perhaps they didn't know, Elizabeth suggested. Or perhaps they knew but chose to raise you as their own without qualification. Mike ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. Could his entire understanding of his family be based on an elaborate fiction? It seemed impossible, yet the evidence Elizabeth presented couldn't be easily dismissed. I need time to think about this, he said finally, and I need to focus on the Packard for now, one mystery at a time. Elizabeth nodded, respecting his need for space. Of course, shall we continue with the cooling system? Grateful for the return to something concrete, something he could understand and fix with tools and expertise, Mike turned back to the Packard's engine. For the next several hours, they worked in comfortable silence, the only sounds the clink of tools against metal and the occasional technical question or observation. By mid-afternoon, Mike had fully documented his grandfather's modifications to the cooling system and developed a plan to recreate them. He was sketching the design when a new sound interrupted. Footsteps heavier than Elizabeth's approaching with purpose. William Montgomery appeared in the doorway, his expression thunderous as he took in the scene. Mike and Elizabeth working side by side, the Packard's engine partially disassembled the journal and documents still visible on the workbench. What the hell is going on here? Montgomery demanded, his voice cold enough to freeze the air between them. Elizabeth straightened her posture, instantly shifting from relaxed collaboration to defensive alertness. Father, I didn't expect you home until evening. Clearly, he replied, his gaze shifting to the workbench where Catherine's journal lay. His face hardened further. Where did you get that? It was Mother's, Elizabeth said simply. It was private, Montgomery countered, striding forward. Not something to be shared with strangers. Mike stepped slightly in front of the workbench, a subtle but unmistakable barrier. Mr. Montgomery, I've identified the issue with the Packard's cooling system. There were custom modifications made in the late 60s that were either removed or overlooked during your restoration. Montgomery's cold gaze fixed on Mike. By your grandfather. It wasn't a question. Yes, Mike acknowledged. Joseph Foster implemented a dual cooling circuit that substantially improved the system's efficiency. Without it, the engine overheats under load exactly as you've experienced. And you discovered this in a single day when 6 specialists could not. Montgomery's tone made it clear he found this suspicious rather than impressive. I had an advantage, Mike replied evenly. I recognized my grandfather's work. Montgomery's jaw tightened. I see. He turned to Elizabeth. A word in private. It wasn't a request. Elizabeth hesitated briefly, then nodded to Mike. I'll be back shortly. Perhaps you could start documenting the modifications in more detail. After they departed, Mike could hear the low rumble of Montgomery's voice from just outside the garage, occasionally punctuated by Elizabeth's more measured tones. The conversation was clearly tense, though he couldn't make out the specific words. While waiting, Mike continued his examination of the Packard, now focusing on the ignition system. As he suspected, he found more of his grandfather's handiwork. Subtle adjustments to improve performance, each one cleverly disguised to appear factory original, unless you knew exactly what to look for. On one of the distributor mounting screws, he noticed something unusual. Tiny marks etched into the metal, almost like initials. Using a magnifying glass from his toolkit, Mike confirmed his suspicion. JF had been delicately inscribed on the screw head, invisible to the casual observer, but a clear signature to anyone looking closely. As he searched further, he found more such markings, small JF initials, hidden on various components throughout the engine. It was as if Joseph Foster had been signing his work, leaving a trail for someone who might one day need to understand his modifications, or for someone who might one day need proof of his contributions. The thought had barely formed when Elizabeth returned, her face composed, but her eyes reflecting inner turmoil. Is everything all right? Mike asked, though the answer was obvious. Father has concerns about the direction of our investigation, she said carefully, both mechanical and personal. He wants me gone, Mike guessed. He suggested your services might no longer be required now that you've identified the issue with the cooling system. Elizabeth's tone made it clear she disagreed. I reminded him that identifying the problem is only half the solution. Implementing it correctly is equally important. Mike nodded slowly. In the personal investigation, Elizabeth sighed, leaning against the workbench. He's aware of my suspicions about you, about our possible connection. He considers it inappropriate and potentially damaging to the Montgomery name. Because I'm a mechanic, Mike asked, a hard edge entering his voice. Because you're not the narrative he's constructed, Elizabeth corrected. William Montgomery has spent a lifetime building and controlling his version of reality. Anything that contradicts that is a threat. Mike considered this, thinking of the carefully hidden JF markings he'd just discovered. Your father didn't just overlook my grandfather's modifications to the Packard. I think he deliberately removed them. Erased Joseph Foster's contributions, just like he tried to erase him from your mother's life. Elizabeth's eyes widened slightly. What makes you say that? Mike showed her the tiny initials on the distributor screw. Granddad signed his work, hidden but unmistakable once you know to look for it. I've found several components with his initials, but only on parts that would be difficult to replace without affecting engine timing or performance. So some parts he modified were removed, Elizabeth concluded. Parts that could be replaced without immediately affecting performance, Mike confirmed, like the cooling system components. But he couldn't remove everything without rendering the engine inoperable, so some of Joseph's work remained hidden in plain sight. Elizabeth's expression hardened with determination. Then we need to document everything, every modification, every signature, before Father decides to take more drastic measures. You think he would? I know he would, Elizabeth said grimly. William Montgomery doesn't leave loose ends, especially ones that threaten his carefully constructed reality. Mike nodded, understanding the urgency. I'll need a few days to fully document everything and develop a restoration plan that incorporates all of your grandfather's modifications. You'll have them, Elizabeth promised. I'll make sure of it. As they returned to work, Mike couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been drawn into something far more complex than a mechanical puzzle, a decades-old web of relationships, secrets, and power that continued to affect lives long after some of the key players had departed. The Packard wasn't just a car needing restoration. It was a physical manifestation of a buried history trying to resurface. And somewhere within its 12 cylinders and custom modifications lay answers that William Montgomery had been trying to suppress for over 50 years. The morning sun cast long shadows across Mike's kitchen as he sat at the worn oak table, a cup of coffee cooling beside him. Spread before him were photocopies of the pages from Catherine Montgomery's journal, his own detailed notes on the Packard's cooling system, and the photograph of his grandfather with Catherine. He'd been up most of the night, his mind racing with possibilities and questions. The technical aspects of the Packard's restoration were straightforward enough. He had documented his grandfather's modifications in detail and developed a plan to recreate them. But the personal implications of what he'd discovered weighed on him like an engine block on his chest. Could Catherine Montgomery truly be his biological mother? And if so, what did that mean for everything he'd believed about himself and his family? The sound of tires on gravel pulled him from his thoughts. Through the kitchen window, he saw his sister Subaru pulling into the driveway. Sarah Foster Jenkins was 5 years his senior, a high school science teacher, with their father's analytical mind and their mother's no-nonsense approach to life. If anyone might have insights into family secrets, it would be her. Sarah entered without knocking, as was her habit. At 50, she remained athletic and energetic. Her dark hair showing only a few strands of gray, her movements purposeful as she set a paper bag of breakfast tacos on the table. "You sounded strange on the phone," she said without preamble, studying his face. "And you look like you haven't slept. What's going on?" Mike pushed the photograph across the table. "Do you recognize him?" Sarah picked it up, adjusting her reading glasses. "Of course, that's Granddad Joe when he was younger." Her gaze shifted to the woman beside him. "Who's the lady? She looks familiar somehow." "Catherine Montgomery," Mike said, watching his sister's reaction carefully. "Mother of Elizabeth Montgomery, the woman who hired me to restore a Packard 12. Sarah's eyebrows rose slightly. "Montgomery? As in Montgomery Holdings, the energy company?" Mike nodded. "The very same." "Huh." Sarah studied the photo more closely. "What's Granddad doing with Catherine Montgomery? And why does she have her hand on his arm like that?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out," Mike replied. He briefly explained his discovery of Joseph's work on the Packard, the journals Elizabeth had shared, and the timing of his birth relative to the end of Catherine and Joseph's friendship. Sarah listened without interruption, her expression growing increasingly troubled. When he finished, she set the photo down carefully and took a long breath. "You think Catherine Montgomery might be your biological mother?" she said. It wasn't a question. "I think it's a possibility," Mike acknowledged. "The timing fits. The connection between her and Granddad is documented in her journals. And there's the matter of her personal physician signing my birth certificate despite having no privileges at the hospital where I was supposedly born." Sarah frowned considering this. "Have you talked to Dad about this?" "Not yet. I wanted to speak with you first." Mike hesitated. "Did you ever get any sense that that Mom might not have been your biological mother?" Sarah shook her head firmly. "Never. Mom loved you fiercely, Mike. From the moment I first saw you in her arms, you were hers. There was never any indication otherwise." "But it's possible they kept it from you," Mike pointed out. "You were only 5 when I was born." Sarah reached for one of the breakfast tacos, unwrapping it slowly as she gathered her thoughts. "I suppose anything's possible, but it would have required an elaborate deception. Mom would have had to fake a pregnancy for months, then suddenly produce a baby, you, without raising suspicions. Unless she was actually pregnant, then lost the baby," Mike suggested quietly. "And Catherine Montgomery's child, possibly conceived with Granddad, became a convenient replacement." Sarah looked troubled by this theory. "That's quite a leap, Mike." "I know how it sounds," he acknowledged, "but the coincidences are piling up. And there's something else." He hesitated, then added, "Elizabeth Montgomery thinks we might be half-siblings, that her mother and our grandfather had an affair that resulted in my birth." Sarah set down her taco appetite, apparently forgotten. "That's a hell of an accusation. What does William Montgomery think of his daughter pursuing this theory?" "He's not thrilled," Mike said dryly. "I get the distinct impression he'd prefer I disappear back to my garage and forget I ever heard the name Montgomery." "Smart man," Sarah muttered. She studied her brother's face. "What do you want, Mike? Assuming this wild theory is true, what outcome are you hoping for?" The question caught him off guard. What did he want? He hadn't really thought beyond discovering the truth. "I'm not after Montgomery money if that's what you're asking," he said finally. "I just want to know who I am, where I came from. And I want to understand what happened to Granddad Joe. Why he suddenly closed his garage in town and moved operations to that small building on his property. Why he became so private in his later years." Sarah nodded slowly. "I remember that change in him. Dad said it was just Granddad getting older, wanting a simpler life. But it did seem sudden." I think William Montgomery might have forced him out, Mike said. If Granddad was involved with Catherine, if I'm the result of that relationship, Montgomery would have had every reason to want Joseph Foster as far from his family as possible. Sarah sighed, rubbing her temples. This is a lot to process, Mike. What's your next step? I need to talk to someone who knew Granddad back then, Mike replied. Someone who might have noticed something off about the timing or remembered gossip about Catherine Montgomery's visits to the garage. Most of Granddad's contemporaries are gone, Sarah pointed out. It's been over 50 years. Mike nodded but then paused as a memory surfaced. Not all of them. What about Tom Williams? He worked with Granddad in the late 60s before opening his own shop in Fredericksburg. Old Tom Hinatem. Sarah considered this. He'd be in his 80s now, but last I heard he was still kicking around. Dad mentioned running into him at a car show a couple years back. I need to find him. Mike said, standing suddenly. He might be the only person left who was there when all this happened. Sarah watched him with concern. Just be careful, Mike. You're potentially stirring up secrets that powerful people have kept buried for decades. The Montgomerys aren't the kind of family you want as enemies. I'm not looking to make enemies, Mike assured her. I just want the truth. About the Packard, about Granddad, about myself. Those three things might be more connected than you realize, Sarah said softly. After Sarah left, Mike spent the morning making calls, tracking down Tom Williams through a network of old mechanics and car enthusiasts. By noon, he had an address, a small ranch outside Fredericksburg, about an hour's drive west. As he headed out, his phone buzzed with a text from Elizabeth. Father leaving for Houston. 3 days of meetings. Garage access confirmed for tomorrow morning. Updates, Mike replied briefly, following a lead. We'll update tomorrow. The drive to Fredericksburg took him through the heart of Texas Hill Country, rolling landscapes dotted with oak and cedar wildflowers stubbornly persisting despite the August heat. The scenery would normally have soothed him, but today Mike barely noticed it, his mind fixed on the questions he hoped Tom Williams might answer. The ranch was modest, 20 acres or so, with a small house, a workshop, and a barn that had been converted into a garage. As Mike pulled up, he spotted an elderly man in overalls working beneath the hood of a 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air, the car's candy apple red paint gleaming in the afternoon sun. Tom Williams straightened as Mike approached, wiping his hands on a rag tucked into his belt. Age had bent his frame somewhat, but his movements remained purposeful, his eyes sharp beneath bushy white eyebrows. Mike Foster, he said, recognition immediate. You're the spitting image of your granddad when he was your age. Mike extended his hand. Mr. Williams, thanks for seeing me on such short notice. Tom, please. The old man's handshake was firm despite his years. And any grandson of Joe Foster is welcome here anytime. He gestured toward the Bel Air, just finishing up an ignition timing adjustment. Want to take a look? Your granddad helped me restore this beauty back in '72. As Mike drove back toward Oak Ridge, the envelope sat on the passenger seat like a time capsule from the past. He hadn't opened it yet, feeling somehow that it should be done in the right place, perhaps in the presence of the Packard, the machine that connected him to his grandfather across decades. Whatever secrets the envelope contained, Mike sensed they would forever change his understanding of Joseph Foster, the Montgomery family, and possibly his own identity. The Packard wasn't just a restoration project anymore. It was a key to unlocking a past that had been deliberately buried, by William Montgomery perhaps, but maybe also by others trying to protect something or someone precious. The morning light filtered through the Montgomery estate's garage windows, casting long shadows across the Packard's elegant form. Mike had arrived early again, the sealed envelope from Tom Williams burning a hole in his pocket. He'd spent a restless night considering whether to open it alone or wait for Elizabeth, ultimately deciding that whatever it contained, she had as much right to know as he did. He busied himself with preliminary work, organizing tools, reviewing his notes on the cooling system, modifications, preparing components for reassembly. The familiar routine of mechanical work helped calm his mind, which had been racing since his conversation with Tom Williams the day before. Elizabeth arrived just after 8, carrying the now customary travel mugs of coffee. She looked tired, with subtle shadows beneath her eyes, suggesting she'd slept no better than he had. Good morning, she said, handing him a mug. You said you were following a lead yesterday. Anything significant? Mike nodded, setting aside his tools. I found Tom Williams. my grandfather's assistant from the late 60s. He remembered your mother and the Packard quite clearly. Elizabeth's eyes widened with interest. What did he say? He confirmed that your mother was a regular visitor to Foster's garage between 1968 and late 1969. Said she and my grandfather had a special connection. Mike hesitated, then continued. He also told me about a visit William Montgomery made to the garage in November 1969, after which my grandfather abruptly closed his in-town business and became much more reclusive. Elizabeth leaned against the workbench, absorbing this information. That fits with what I've pieced together from Mother Easter journals. The timeline matches exactly. There's more, Mike said, withdrawing the sealed-on envelope from his pocket. Tom gave me this. Apparently, my grandfather left it with him when he retired, hidden inside a tool case. Elizabeth studied the wax seal with its JF impression. You haven't opened it. Not yet. I thought we should do it together, given that it might contain information relevant to both of us. She nodded, appreciation evident in her eyes. Thank you for that. Mike carefully broke the seal, trying to preserve the JF impression as much as possible. Inside was a single, folded document and a small key. The document was a hand-drawn schematic of the Packard's cooling system, far more detailed than any factory manual, with Joseph Foster's modifications clearly indicated in red ink. Notes in the margins explained each change, the reasoning behind it, and the expected performance improvements. At the bottom, in clear, precise handwriting, was a message. For Catherine, may this serve as a guide should future mechanics need to understand why this wonderful machine runs as it does. Every modification made with care, every improvement a labor of love, much like our conversations these past months. Yours always, Joseph. Beneath this was a postscript. The key opens the storage compartment beneath the Packard's rear seat cushion. What's inside belongs to you alone. Mike and Elizabeth exchanged glances. Without a word, they moved to the Packard. Elizabeth carefully removed the rear seat cushion, revealing a small, nearly invisible compartment built into the frame. Not a factory feature, but a custom addition. Mike inserted the key into a well-concealed lock, and the compartment opened with a soft click. Inside was a leather-bound journal similar to Catherine's, but smaller, with JF embossed on the cover. Beside it lay a small box covered in faded blue velvet. Elizabeth gently lifted out the journal while Mike took the box. Opening it revealed a simple silver bracelet with a single charm, a miniature wrench exquisitely crafted from what appeared to be platinum. It was a gift, Elizabeth murmured, flipping through the journal's pages. From Mother to your grandfather. Look. She pointed to an entry dated July 17, 1969. Catherine brought me a gift today. A bracelet with a platinum wrench charm she had specially made. Said it reminded her of me, of our time together. I can't wear it, of course. Too many questions would arise. But I'll keep it always hidden where William can never find it. Like so many things between us, it must remain a secret, though I wish it could be otherwise. Mike examined the bracelet more closely. Engraved on the back of the charm, barely visible without a magnifying glass, were the initials CM2JF and a date 7/15/69. Your grandfather's journal, Elizabeth said softly, turning pages with careful reverence. It appears he kept it during the period of their friendship. Mike moved beside her, looking over her shoulder as she found entries corresponding to the dates in Catherine's journal. March 15, 1968. A Packard 12 came into the shop today. A genuine work of art despite the dealership's butchery of its cooling system. The owner, Catherine Montgomery, is unlike any client I've ever had. Knowledgeable, curious, and treated me as an equal rather than hired help. Fixed the water pump alignment issue, but the car deserves better. Have sketched plans for cooling system improvements that would make this engine sing as it was meant to. September 18, 1968. Catherine's monthly visit. The Packard runs beautifully after the ignition timing adjustments. We discussed Hemingway over sandwiches. Her insights on The Old Man and the Sea were more profound than any English professor's. She notices details others miss in books and in life. A rare quality in anyone, let alone someone from her social circle. The hours pass too quickly when she visits. The entries continued growing more personal as the months progressed, mirroring the evolution in Catherine's journal. But Joseph's writing contained something Catherine's had not. Explicit acknowledgement of deepening feelings. June 12, 1969. I find myself watching the clock on Thursdays counting minutes until her arrival. This isn't wise. She's married wealthy from a world I'll never belong in. And yet, when she's here, those differences vanish. We're just two people who see each other clearly, who value the same things. Honesty, craftsmanship, the beauty in machines and words. I should end these visits before they become something neither of us can control, but I lack the strength to do what's right. Mike felt a strange tightness in his chest reading his grandfather's private thoughts, the growing acknowledgement of feelings that echoed across decades, feelings that might have led to his very existence. The most revealing entry came in late August 1969, August 28, 1969. Catherine arrived unexpectedly today, visibly upset. William discovered her journals read enough to suspect something improper between us. She fears for my safety, my business. I assured her William Montgomery doesn't frighten me, but the truth is more complicated. It's not my safety I fear for, but hers, and the consequences she might face. We made a decision, one I pray is right. God forgive me if it's not. The entry was frustratingly vague about what decision they had made, but the timing aligned perfectly with Catherine's pregnancy, assuming Mike had been the result. The final entries were sparse, increasingly anxious, December 18, 1969. A boy, healthy, perfect. I held him today, this miracle we created. My heart simultaneously full and breaking. Catherine sends word through Andrew that she is recovering well, though William keeps her isolated. We've agreed, no contact ever again. The boy must never know. His life would be torn apart by the truth, by William's rage. Better he grows up as a foster loved by Robert and Mary than caught between two worlds that cannot be reconciled. Mike lowered himself onto a nearby stool, the journal entries confirming what he had begun to suspect, but hadn't fully accepted until this moment. Joseph Foster wasn't his grandfather. He was his father, and Catherine Montgomery was his mother. Elizabeth sat beside him, her face pale but composed. So it's true, she said quietly. We are half-siblings. Mike nodded, still processing the implications. They arranged it all. The fake birth certificate, having your mother's doctor oversee the birth, my father and his wife agreeing to raise me as their own. He looked up at Elizabeth. But why? Why not just, I don't know, get divorced, be together? You don't understand what William Montgomery was like back then, Elizabeth said. His reputation, his social standing, were everything. A divorce would have been scandalous enough, but his wife leaving him for a mechanic, having another man's child, it would have destroyed everything he'd built. So instead they gave me up, Mike said, a hint of bitterness entering his voice. They protected you, Elizabeth corrected gently. Think about it, Mike. If William had known you were Joseph's son, do you think he would have allowed you to exist peacefully? He would have used every resource at his disposal to make your life, and Joseph's, a living hell. Mike considered this, remembering Tom Williams' description of his grandfather after William Montgomery's visit. Aged, withdrawn, fundamentally changed. Your father threatened him. Threatened my father, Robert, too. Almost certainly, Elizabeth agreed. Father has always believed in leveraging every possible point of pressure. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of these revelations settling around them. Finally, Mike gestured toward the Packard. This car was their connection, he said. Every modification my father made was a message to your mother. His expertise speaking to her appreciation for craftsmanship, his attention to detail, reflecting how closely he listened to her. And when father began his restoration, Elizabeth added, he systematically removed those modifications, those tangible connections between Joseph and mother. It wasn't just about making the car run properly. It was about erasing Joseph Foster from the narrative entirely. Mike stood, suddenly moving to the Packard's engine compartment. We need to document everything. Every modification, every hidden JF marking. Not just for the restoration, but as evidence. Evidence of what? Elizabeth asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. Of the truth, Mike replied simply. Your father has been hiding it for over 50 years. It's time it came to light. Elizabeth hesitated. Mike, I understand how you feel, but consider the consequences. This revelation would affect not just us, but multiple families. Your parents, the people who raised you, chose to keep this secret. Are you sure you want to expose it now? Mike paused, considering her words. My father, Robert, is gone. Died 3 years ago from a heart attack. My mother, Mary, is in a care facility with advanced dementia. She barely recognizes Sarah or me most days. He sighed heavily. There's no one left to hurt with the trauma, at least not on my side. There's still father, Elizabeth pointed out, and revealing this publicly would create a scandal that would affect Montgomery Holdings, our employees, our shareholders. I'm not talking about holding a press conference, Mike clarified, but I do think William Montgomery needs to acknowledge the truth. To us, at least. No more pretending, no more erasing history. Elizabeth nodded slowly. I agree, but we need to approach this carefully. Father is not a man who responds well to ultimatums or confrontations. Then how do you suggest we proceed? We finish the restoration first, Elizabeth said decisively. Prove that Joseph Foster's work was essential to the Packard's proper functioning. Document everything thoroughly. Then with that leverage, we request a private meeting with Father. Mike considered this approach, recognizing its strategic wisdom. All right, we focus on the car for now, but I'm keeping the journal and the bracelet safe. Of course, Elizabeth agreed. They're rightfully yours. As they returned to work on the Packard, Mike found himself seeing the car with new eyes. It wasn't just a magnificent machine needing restoration. It was a physical embodiment of the connection between Joseph Foster and Catherine Montgomery, a love story written in metal and engineering, hidden beneath the hood for decades. Every component he touched now carried additional significance, every modification a message from father to son across time. The Packard had brought Joseph and Catherine together, and now half a century later, it had reunited their children. The irony wasn't lost on Mike, that William Montgomery's determination to restore his wife's favorite car had ultimately led to the very revelation he had spent decades trying to prevent. The past couldn't stay buried forever, especially when it was encoded in 12 cylinders of American engineering excellence. The tension in William Montgomery's study was palpable, the air thick with unspoken accusations and long-buried secrets. The room itself reflected its owner's personality. Dark wood paneling, leather-bound books arranged by height on built-in shelves, a massive desk positioned to ensure Montgomery held the power position in any conversation. Elizabeth stood near the window arms, crossed defensively, while her father sat behind his desk, his expression carved from granite. Mike remained by the door, feeling distinctly out of place among the trappings of old money and power. You had no right, Montgomery said, his voice controlled but edged with anger. Those journals were private. Catherine's personal thoughts were not meant to be shared, especially not with outsiders. Mike is hardly an outsider, Father, Elizabeth replied coolly. Not given what we've discovered. Montgomery's gaze shifted to Mike's cold assessment in his eyes. What you think you've discovered is irrelevant. Ancient history has no bearing on the present. Except when it does, Mike said, stepping forward. Like when that history affects the restoration of a Packard 12 that's sitting in your garage. The car, Montgomery said dismissively. This entire charade was supposedly about the car. It was never just about the car, Elizabeth countered. Not for you, not for Mother, not for Joseph Foster. The mention of Joseph's name caused a muscle to jump in Montgomery's jaw, a small tell, but significant. I hired Mr. Foster to assess a mechanical issue, not to dig through family archives. You hired me because Elizabeth suggested it, Mike corrected, and I suspect she did so because she'd already found her mother's journals and recognized my name, my connection to Joseph Foster. Montgomery turned to his daughter, betrayal flashing briefly across his features. You orchestrated this, brought him here, deliberately. Elizabeth met his gaze unflinchingly. I wanted the truth, Father. After a lifetime of carefully curated family narratives, I wanted something real. The truth. Montgomery repeated the word, dripping with disdain. What good has ever come from disturbing the past? What purpose does it serve except to create unnecessary pain? We have a right to know who we are, Mike said quietly, where we came from. Montgomery's attention returned to Mike, his expression hardening further. And what exactly do you think you know, Mr. Foster? Mike hesitated, weighing his words carefully. This confrontation had not been part of the plan. They were still documenting Joseph's modifications, still building their case through the Packard's restoration. But Montgomery's unexpected early return from Houston had forced their hand when he'd discovered them reviewing Joseph's journal in the garage. "I know that Joseph Foster was my biological father," Mike said finally, "and Catherine Montgomery was my biological mother." The words hung in the air like smoke, acrid and impossible to ignore. Montgomery's face remained impassive, but his knuckles whitened as he gripped the arms of his chair. "Preposterous," he said, but the denial lacked conviction. "We have evidence," Elizabeth interjected. "Joseph's journal documenting everything. Catherine's medical records showing a pregnancy in 1969. Payments to Dr. Andrew Kelly, who conveniently signed Mike's birth certificate despite having no hospital privileges where he was supposedly born." "Circumstantial," Montgomery dismissed. "Nothing definitive." "DNA would be definitive," Mike pointed out. "A simple test would confirm whether Elizabeth and I share a maternal connection." Something shifted in Montgomery's expression. Resignation, perhaps, or calculation. He rose from his chair, moving to a cabinet near the window. From it, he withdrew a crystal decanter and 3 glasses, pouring a measure of amber liquid into each. "Bourbon," he said, offering glasses to Mike and Elizabeth. "If we're to have this conversation, I suspect we all need it." The sudden shift in tone caught Mike off guard. He accepted the drink, cautiously watching as Montgomery returned to his chair, suddenly looking older, more worn than his carefully maintained appearance usually allowed. "I always knew this day might come," Montgomery said after a long silence. "Hoped it wouldn't, of course. Took precautions, made arrangements, but secrets have a way of surfacing, particularly the ones we most wish to keep buried." "So you're not denying it," Elizabeth said, surprise evident in her voice. Montgomery took a measured sip of his bourbon. "Would denial serve any purpose at this point? You've found Joseph's journal, Catherine's records. You've connected the dots quite effectively." "Why?" Mike asked the question that had been burning inside him. "Why the elaborate deception? Why not just allow them to be together?" A harsh laugh escaped Montgomery, devoid of humor. "You can't possibly be that naive. Do you have any concept of what was at stake? What scandal would have meant in those circles in that era? Your reputation." Elizabeth supplied a hint of bitterness in her voice. "Not just my reputation," Montgomery corrected sharply. "The entire Montgomery legacy. The business was expanding rapidly, dependent on contracts with conservative oil companies, relationships with traditional banking institutions. A divorce alone would have been damaging. Catherine leaving me for a mechanic bearing his child, it would have destroyed everything my father and I had built." "So you threatened Joseph," Mike said, "forced him to give up his child to close his business in town." Montgomery studied Mike over the rim of his glass. "I offered him alternatives. He chose the one that protected you, that protected Catherine, that allowed his family business to continue, albeit in a more limited capacity." "What alternatives?" Elizabeth pressed. Montgomery sighed, setting his glass down with deliberate care. "I made it clear that should the situation become public, I would use every resource at my disposal to ensure Joseph Foster never worked as a mechanic again in Texas. That his son Robert would find himself similarly blacklisted. That Catherine would lose custody of you, Elizabeth, and be left without financial support." "You threatened to destroy everyone he cared about," Mike translated, anger building in his chest. "I protected what was mine," Montgomery corrected coldly. "Catherine was my wife. Montgomery Holdings was my legacy. I wasn't about to lose either to a man who changed oil for a living." The contempt in his voice sparked something in Mike, not just anger but determination. "That man who changed oil was a mechanical genius whose modifications to your wife's Packard have stumped every expert you've hired for the past 8 years. His work was so precise, so innovative, that you haven't been able to make that car run properly without it, despite all your resources and expertise." Montgomery's expression flickered, a hit finally breaking through his composed facade. "Joseph Foster was more than just a mechanic," Mike continued, pressing his advantage. "He was an artist with machines, and Catherine recognized that, appreciated it in a way you never could." "Enough," Montgomery snapped, standing abruptly. "Whatever Joseph Foster was or wasn't is irrelevant now. He's dead. Catherine is dead. The past is past." "Except I'm not dead," undead, Mike said quietly. "I'm right here, your wife's son with another man. living proof that your perfect narrative was built on lies. Elizabeth moved to stand beside Mike, a gesture of solidarity that didn't go unnoticed by her father. What do you want, Mike, from all of this? The question caught him slightly off guard. What did he want? Revenge against the man who had separated his biological parents, recognition as Catherine Montgomery's son, a share of the Montgomery fortune. I want to finish restoring the Packard, he said finally, properly incorporating all of Joseph's modifications. I want his work recognized, not erased. And then Montgomery pressed clearly, expecting more demands. And then I want acknowledgement, Mike continued. My public, not a press release announcing me as the long-lost Montgomery heir. Just private recognition between us that Catherine was my mother, that Joseph was my father, and that your attempts to bury that truth end now. Montgomery studied him with narrowed eyes, clearly searching for ulterior motives. No financial claims against the estate, no lawsuit for your rightful inheritance. Mike shook his head. I've built my own life. I don't need or want Montgomery money. A tense silence filled the room as Montgomery considered this, his calculating gaze moving from Mike to Elizabeth and back again. Finally, he spoke. The restoration can continue, he said, each word precise and measured. You may document Joseph's modifications, implement them as necessary to make the car functional. But understand this, once the Packard is running properly, our association ends. No further contact, no further excavation of the past. Father, Elizabeth began, but Montgomery cut her off with a sharp gesture. This is non-negotiable, Elizabeth. Mr. Foster completes the restoration. I acknowledge the historical facts privately, and then we all return to our separate lives. Mike felt Elizabeth tense beside him, ready to argue further, but he placed a hand gently on her arm. It's a start, he said quietly. Let's focus on the Packard first. Montgomery nodded curtly, clearly relieved to return the conversation to mechanical matters rather than emotional ones. You'll have full access to the garage, whatever parts or tools you require. Elizabeth will serve as liaison. I prefer not to be involved in the day-to-day details. Understood, Mike said, recognizing the dismissal for what it was. As they turned to leave, Montgomery spoke again, his tone deceptively casual. One thing, Mr. Foster, I'd advise against pursuing a DNA test or making any public claims regarding your theories about parentage. Such actions would have consequences beyond what you might anticipate. The threat was thinly veiled, but Mike refused to be intimidated. I'm not interested in public declarations, Mr. Montgomery, just the truth. The truth, Montgomery echoed, that same contemptuous tone returning. A luxury few can afford in positions of true responsibility. Outside the study, Elizabeth exhaled shakily, the tension of the confrontation finally breaking. That was not how I planned to approach this. Your father doesn't strike me as the type who responds well to carefully planned approaches, Mike observed dryly. At least now everything's in the open. Between us, anyway. Elizabeth nodded, leading him down the hallway toward the main entrance. He's concerned about damage control, about containing the situation. That's why he agreed so readily to your continued work on the Packard. It keeps you close where he can monitor the situation. I figured as much, Mike replied. I'm less interested in his motivations than in getting that car running the way Joseph intended. That's the best tribute I can offer to both our parents. Elizabeth smiled faintly at his phrasing. Our parents. The first acknowledgement of their shared heritage that didn't sound clinical or analytical. It's strange, she said softly. All my life, I've been an only child. Now suddenly I have a brother. Half-brother, Mike corrected automatically. Family, Elizabeth countered, her gray eyes, Catherine's eyes, meeting his directly. Something I've had precious little of that wasn't wrapped in obligation and expectation. Mike nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Despite the shock of discovering his true parentage, there was something oddly comforting about finding this connection, this sister he never knew he had. We should get back to work, he said finally. That Packard isn't going to restore itself. As they walked toward the garage, Mike felt a strange sense of purpose settling over him. The Packard had brought Joseph and Catherine together decades ago. Now it was bringing their children together, offering a chance to honor connections that William Montgomery had tried so hard to sever. Whatever happened after the restoration was complete, whatever boundaries Montgomery might try to impose, Mike knew one thing with certainty. The truth was finally emerging from the shadows, like a finely crafted machine being brought back to life after years of neglect. Morning sunlight streamed through the high windows of the Montgomery garage, illuminating dust particles that danced in the air like tiny constellations. Mike had been working since dawn, meticulously rebuilding the Packard's cooling system, according to Joseph's detailed schematics. Elizabeth sat nearby at a workbench, organizing and cataloging the journals and photographs they had discovered, creating a comprehensive timeline of Catherine and Joseph's relationship. For 3 days, they had worked in comfortable tandem, their shared purpose creating an easy rhythm, despite the emotional weight of their discoveries. William Montgomery had made himself scarce, apparently preferring to avoid further confrontation while the restoration progressed. "I found something interesting," Elizabeth said, breaking the companionable silence. "A discrepancy in the dates." Mike looked up from the water pump he was modifying. "What kind of discrepancy?" According to Mother's medical records, she would have been almost 6 months pregnant in September 1969 when this photo was taken. Elizabeth held up the image of Catherine and Joseph beside the Packard. "But she doesn't look 6 months pregnant here. Maybe 3 months at most." Mike wiped his hands and moved to examine the photo more closely. "You're right, the timing doesn't add up. And then there's what Tom Williams said about thinking I had a sister." Elizabeth tapped a finger thoughtfully against her chin. "What if I did? What if you weren't Mother's only pregnancy from that period?" Mike frowned, considering the implications. "You think there might have been another child before me?" "It would explain the timeline inconsistency," Elizabeth said. "If Mother was pregnant earlier in 1969, lost the baby, then became pregnant with you shortly afterward. That's a lot of conjecture from one photograph," Mike pointed out. "True, but it would make sense of certain things, like why Father became suspicious in August according to Joseph's journal. If Mother was already showing by then, it would have been obvious something was happening." Mike nodded slowly, the theory gaining plausibility in his mind. "And if she lost that first child, it might explain why they were so determined to protect me. A second chance they couldn't lose." Elizabeth returned to her documents, rifling through medical records with renewed purpose. There must be something here, some evidence. While she searched, Mike continued his work on the cooling system, but his mind kept returning to the possibility of an earlier pregnancy, a lost sibling. It would fill certain gaps in the timeline and explain why Catherine and Joseph had taken such extreme measures to protect their second child. Him. "Found it," Elizabeth said suddenly, her voice tight with emotion. "Hospital records from June 1969. Mother was admitted for complications related to pregnancy and discharged 3 days later. No baby, just a note from Dr. Kelly indicating complete loss at approximately 20 weeks gestation." Mike set down his tools, the implications settling heavily. "She lost a baby at 5 months, and then got pregnant again almost immediately after." "With you," Elizabeth confirmed softly. "You were their second chance." The revelation added new layers to an already complex emotional landscape. Mike wasn't just a child born of a forbidden relationship. He was the replacement for a lost first attempt, a healing after profound grief. It explained the desperate measures, the elaborate deception, the willingness of Robert and Mary Foster to raise him as their own. "Does your father know about this?" Mike asked. "About the first pregnancy?" Elizabeth shook her head. "I don't think so. If he'd known Mother was pregnant in early 1969, he wouldn't have waited until August to confront Joseph. The timeline suggests he discovered something, perhaps parts of her journal, but not the full extent of their relationship. Which might explain why he was so determined to erase Joseph from the narrative," Mike mused. "He suspected but couldn't prove that Catherine had been unfaithful. The journals gave him enough to threaten Joseph, but not enough to know for certain about me." Elizabeth nodded slowly. "Until now." They worked in thoughtful silence for a while, each processing this new information in their own way. For Mike, it added gravity to his restoration work. The Packard wasn't just a magnificent machine or even just a connection to his biological parents. It represented a relationship so profound that it had endured loss, separation, and decades of enforced silence. By mid-afternoon, Mike had completed the modifications to the cooling system, faithfully recreating Joseph's dual-circuit design. The engine compartment now contained all the original improvements, each one implemented with the same precision Joseph had shown 50 years earlier. "I think we're ready for a test," Mike announced, wiping his hands on a shop rag. "All Joseph's modifications are in place, everything's connected and calibrated." Elizabeth looked up from her documentation. "Really, I thought it would take another day at least." "Working from his schematics made it go faster," Mike explained. "Plus, I've had a good helper." He smiled, acknowledging her contributions over the past days, handing him tools holding parts in place, learning the intricacies of the Packard systems alongside him. "Should we call Father?" Elizabeth asked hesitantly. "He'd want to be here for the first startup." Mike considered this. Part of him wanted to prove the success of Joseph's design without William Montgomery present. A small, perhaps petty victory, but another part recognized that this moment belonged to all of them, connected as they were by this machine and the history it contained. "Yes," he said finally, "he should be here." While Elizabeth went to find her father, Mike made final preparations, checking fluid levels, ensuring all connections were secure, preparing for the Packard's first startup since the restoration of Joseph's cooling system modifications. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, but his mind raced with the implications of everything they had discovered: the lost first pregnancy, the desperate measures taken to protect him, the decades of secrets layered upon secrets. William Montgomery arrived 10 minutes later, his face an expressionless mask as he surveyed the scene. He wore a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up precisely to mid-forearm tailored slacks and leather loafers that probably cost more than Mike's monthly mortgage payment. Casual by Montgomery standards, but still radiating authority and privilege. "Elizabeth says you're ready for a test," he said, his tone carefully neutral. Mike nodded. "The cooling system has been fully restored according to Joseph's original modifications. All connections are secure. Fluids are at proper levels." He gestured toward the engine. "Would you like to do the honors?" A flicker of surprise crossed Montgomery's face at the offer. After a moment's hesitation, he shook his head. "No, this is your work. You should be the one to see if it succeeds." The acknowledgement, small as it was, didn't go unnoticed. Mike moved to the driver's side door, opened it, and settled into the leather seat that still carried the faint impression of Catherine Montgomery's presence after all these years. The key slid into the ignition with the solid, satisfying feel of pre-war engineering. Mike took a deep breath, said a silent prayer to whatever automotive deities might be listening, and turned the key. The Packard's massive V12 engine turned over once, twice, then roared to life with a deep, resonant rumble that filled the garage like orchestral music. The sound was magnificent. 12 cylinders firing in perfect sequence, a mechanical symphony composed half a century ago by Joseph Foster and now brought back to life by his son. Mike watched the gauges carefully, particularly the temperature indicator. The needle rose, gradually settling precisely in the middle of the normal operating range. He let the engine idle for a full minute, then another, watching for any signs of the overheating that had plagued William Montgomery's restoration attempts. 3 minutes passed, then 4, 5. The temperature remained rock steady, exactly where it should be. "It works," Elizabeth said, her voice filled with wonder. "It actually works." Montgomery stepped closer, his expression now openly amazed as he stared at the temperature gauge. "6 experts," he murmured. 6 so-called specialists couldn't solve this in 8 years. "Because they didn't understand what they were looking at," Mike explained, a hint of pride in his voice. "Joseph didn't just modify the cooling system, he reimagined it, created a dual-circuit approach that balanced cooling across all 12 cylinders in a way the factory never considered." "Genius," Montgomery acknowledged reluctantly. Whatever else he was, the man was a mechanical genius. Mike revved the engine slightly, listening to the perfect response. No hesitation, no rough spots, just pure power delivered with sophisticated precision. After running it for a full 10 minutes with no change in operating temperature, he shut it down, the magnificent V12 falling silent with a dignified sigh. "The restoration is complete," Mike said, climbing out of the driver's seat. "At least the mechanical portion. The cosmetic work, paint, upholstery, chrome, that's for specialists with different skills than mine." Montgomery nodded, approaching the Packard with a mixture of admiration and something more complex, perhaps regret or even grief. He ran his hand along the fender in a gesture almost like a caress. Catherine loved this car, he said so quietly it might have been to himself. Said it was the only thing in her life she had complete control over. The admission hung in the air, surprisingly vulnerable from a man who had spent decades constructing barriers around his emotions. She had good taste, Mike offered. It's a magnificent machine. Montgomery looked up, meeting Mike's gaze directly for perhaps the first time since they'd met. Yes, she did. A beat passed. In many things. The acknowledgement, subtle as it was, felt monumental. A tacit recognition of Catherine's relationship with Joseph and by extension of Mike's place in this complex family narrative. Elizabeth moved to stand beside her father, placing a hand gently on his arm. The Packard can be fully restored now, Father. Mechanically sound exactly as Mother would have wanted it. Yes, Montgomery agreed, his voice distant, exactly as she would have wanted. An awkward silence descended the three of them, standing around the Packard like mourners at a funeral, which in some ways it was. A memorial to Catherine and Joseph, to the love they had shared, to the child they had lost, and to the son they had protected through elaborate deception. We should talk about next steps, Elizabeth said finally, for the car and other matters. Montgomery straightened, his moment of vulnerability clearly over. The car will be sent to Barrett's in Austin for cosmetic restoration. Mr. Foster's work here is complete. He turned to Mike. You've fulfilled your contract admirably. The payment will be processed immediately. Thank you, Mike said, understanding that Montgomery was attempting to draw a line under their association. But there are still some matters to resolve between us. Montgomery's expression hardened. I believe our agreement was clear. You restored the Packard, implementing Joseph's modifications. I've acknowledged the historical facts. Our business is concluded. Father, Elizabeth began, but Montgomery silenced her with a raised hand. No, Elizabeth, I've made concessions I never intended to make. I've allowed access to private family documents, tolerated intrusions into matters long settled. But there must be limits. He turned back to Mike. You have your answers, Mr. Foster. You know who your biological parents were. You've honored your father's work by restoring it. Be satisfied with that. Mike felt frustration rising but kept his tone measured. And what about Elizabeth? Is she supposed to pretend she doesn't have a brother now? Half-brother, Montgomery corrected coldly. A biological curiosity, nothing more. Father. Elizabeth's voice cracked with shock. Montgomery's expression didn't change. Reality is often uncomfortable, Elizabeth, but facts remain facts. You and Mr. Foster share some DNA. That doesn't make you family in any meaningful sense. That's not your decision to make, Elizabeth countered, a steel in her voice that echoed Catherine's from the journal entries. Mike and I are adults. We'll determine for ourselves what our relationship means. Montgomery's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, the garage door opened, admitting a tall, distinguished man in a suit that Mike recognized as Charles Webster, the Montgomery family attorney. William Webster called, then stopped abruptly, taking in the scene before him. I apologize for the interruption. Your secretary said I would find you here. It's fine, Charles, Montgomery replied, visibly relieved by the interruption. We were just discussing the completion of the Packard's mechanical restoration. Webster glanced at the cow, then at Mike, a flicker of recognition crossing his features. Successful, I take it? Completely, Elizabeth confirmed. Mike identified and implemented the necessary modifications. The engine runs perfectly now. Excellent news, Webster said, though his attention seemed divided. William, there's a matter requiring your immediate attention. The Houston merger documents need review before close of business today. Montgomery nodded, clearly grateful for the excuse to exit the increasingly tense conversation. Of course, we'll continue in my study. He turned to Elizabeth and Mike. I trust you can handle the final details here. It wasn't a question, and he didn't wait for a response, already moving toward the door with Webster at his side. As they departed, Mike caught a fragment of their lowered conversation. Webster asking, "Is that him, Joseph Foster's boy?" And Montgomery's terse response, "Later, Charles." When they were alone again, Elizabeth sighed heavily. I'm sorry about that. Father's never been good at confronting emotional realities. It's fine, Mike said, though they both knew it wasn't. He's processing a lot. Finding out your wife had a child with another man, even decades later, can't be easy. Elizabeth studied him thoughtfully. You're being remarkably understanding toward a man who separated your parents and essentially erased your true identity. Mike shrugged, turning back to the Packard and beginning to gather his tools. What's the alternative? Rage lawsuits, public scandal. None of that brings Catherine or Joseph back. None of it changes the past. No, Elizabeth agreed softly, but it might affect the future. Mike looked up, catching her meaning. You think your father will try to prevent us from maintaining contact after this? I know he will, Elizabeth said with certainty. It's how he operates. Containment, control, separation of threatening elements. And I'm a threatening element. It wasn't a question. To his narrative, absolutely. Elizabeth moved closer, helping him collect his tools. But I have no intention of letting him dictate my relationships. You're my brother Mike, the only blood family I have left who isn't, well, William Montgomery. And the simple declaration touched Mike more deeply than he expected. Despite the whirlwind of revelations and emotions over the past days, this connection with Elizabeth, this sister he never knew he had, felt like solid ground in shifting sands. So what do we do? He asked, closing his toolbox. About your father, about our situation. Elizabeth considered this, her expression thoughtful. We proceed carefully. Father's primary concern is public exposure scandal affecting Montgomery Holdings. As long as we're discreet, he'll reluctantly tolerate our connection. In the Packard, my work here is essentially done. But the cosmetic restoration will take months, Elizabeth pointed out. Regular consultations will be necessary to ensure Barrett's doesn't inadvertently undo any of your mechanical work. You'll need to inspect their progress periodically. Mike smiled, understanding her strategy. Creating legitimate reasons for ongoing contact. Exactly, Elizabeth confirmed with a conspiratorial smile. Father can hardly object to ensuring his wife's beloved Packard is properly restored. They continued cleaning up the workspace, falling into the comfortable rhythm they'd developed over the past days. As they worked, Mike found himself studying the Packard with mixed emotions. Pride in the restoration connection to Joseph's craftsmanship, and a bittersweet awareness that this magnificent machine had been both the beginning and end of his biological parents' relationship. There's something else we should discuss, Elizabeth said, breaking his reverie. The day test. Mike looked up sharply. Your father made his feelings on that pretty clear. Yes, he did, Elizabeth agreed, which makes me all the more certain we should do it. Why, we have the journals, the photographs, the medical records, isn't that enough? Elizabeth's expression grew more serious. Documents can be questioned, even dismissed. Scientific evidence is harder to refute, and she hesitated. I think it matters establishing our connection definitively, for both of us. Mike considered this, understanding her need for certainty, for irrefutable proof of the connection they both felt. All right, he agreed finally, but discreetly, no labs that might leak information to the press. I know a facility in Houston, Elizabeth assured him. They handle high-profile paternity cases with absolute confidentiality. We can have results within a week. And if your father finds out, a determined expression settled over Elizabeth's features, a look Mike was beginning to recognize as pure Catherine Montgomery. Then he'll have to accept that I'm an adult making my own decisions about my family relationships. The word family lingered between them, carrying weight and possibility. Despite all the complexities, all the painful history, that simple truth remained. They were family, connected by blood and by the shared legacy of Catherine and Joseph's love. The DNA test results confirmed what they had suspected. Mike and Elizabeth were half-siblings sharing the same mother but different fathers. The atmosphere was tense but civil, with minimal direct interaction between Mike and Montgomery. When the time came to sign, Montgomery's pen moved across the paper with practiced efficiency, his expression giving nothing away. Mike signed it next, feeling the weight of history in the simple act of putting ink to paper. With his signature, Catherine and Joseph's relationship, their child, him, was formally acknowledged after 50 years of enforced silence. As the copies were distributed and the participants prepared to leave, Montgomery approached Mike directly for the first time that day. Mr. Foster, he said, his voice low enough that only Mike could hear. I trust this concludes our business permanently. Mike met his gaze steadily. The legal aspects, yes. Montgomery's jaw tightened slightly. You have what you wanted. Formal acknowledgement. Don't expect more. I never did, Mike replied honestly. Just the truth on paper where it can't be erased again. Something flickered in Montgomery's eyes. Not quite understanding, but perhaps a grudging recognition of Mike's limited objectives. With a curt nod, he turned and departed, Webster following in his wake. Elizabeth remained behind, waiting until her father had gone before approaching the mic. It's done, she said simply. It's done. Mike agreed, the signed agreement in his hand, feeling simultaneously weightier and less significant than he had anticipated. How does it feel, she asked, getting the acknowledgement you sought? Mike considered this, trying to identify the complex emotions swirling within him. Like closing a circle, he said finally. Not an ending exactly, but a completion of something that began before I was born. Elizabeth nodded, understanding in her eyes. Catherine and Joseph would be proud, I think. Not of the legal maneuvering, but of your determination to honor their memory, to refuse erasure. As they left Thompson's office together, Mike felt a curious lightness. The legal battle had been resolved without the scorched earth conflict many had predicted. The truth had been acknowledged formally and permanently. And most importantly, he had gained a sister, a connection to Catherine that went beyond documents and day tests. Whatever restrictions the agreement placed on their public appearances, nothing could diminish the bond that had formed between them. A bond built not just on shared genetics, but on shared values, shared determination, and a shared commitment to honoring the truth of their origins. The Packard, meanwhile, continued its cosmetic restoration at Barrett's in Austin, its mechanical heart now beating exactly as Joseph Foster had intended, a testament to craftsmanship that had endured despite decades of attempted erasure. The Packard gleamed under the bright lights of Barrett's restoration shop in Austin, its newly applied paint, the exact shade of silver specified in the original 1938 factory documents, catching and reflecting every beam. Mike circled the vehicle, slowly examining the exterior work with a critical eye. 3 months had passed since the legal agreement with William Montgomery, 3 months of careful coordination between Mike's mechanical expertise and Barrett's cosmetic restoration specialists. The results were nothing short of spectacular. She's a beauty, said Jack Barrett, the shop's owner, a third-generation restoration expert with a reputation for period-perfect work. One of the finest examples of a Packard 12 I've ever had the privilege to touch. Mike nodded in agreement. The paint is perfect, exactly the right depth and luster for the era. We use traditional techniques, Barrett explained. Multiple hand-rubbed layers, just like they would have done in '38. No shortcuts. It shows, Mike acknowledged. The chrome work is exceptional too. Barrett beamed with pride. Each piece hand polishes. The bumpers alone took my best guy 40 hours. Mike continued his inspection, checking that none of the cosmetic work had interfered with the mechanical systems he had so carefully restored. The Packard was nearly complete now, engine rebuilt according to Joseph's specifications, cooling system incorporating all his custom modifications, body restored to factory-perfect condition, interior reupholstered in the original leather with period-correct stitching. Only a few final adjustments remained before the car would be ready to return to the Montgomery estate, fully restored after years of waiting in mechanical limbo. When do you expect Elizabeth? Barrett asked, checking his watch. Any minute, Mike replied. She wanted to see the final result before we make the last adjustments. As if on cue, the shop's front door opened and Elizabeth entered, dressed casually in jeans and a light sweater. Since the legal agreement, they had settled into a comfortable routine, meeting regularly to discuss the Packard's restoration, sharing meals at out-of-the-way restaurants, gradually building a relationship that honored their shared heritage without publicly challenging William Montgomery's carefully constructed narrative. Mike, Elizabeth called, her face lighting up as she approached. How does she look? See for yourself, Mike said, gesturing toward the Packard. Elizabeth circled the car slowly, much as Mike had done, her expression shifting from appreciation to something deeper, a connection to the machine that had meant so much to her mother, that had brought Catherine and Joseph together, and that had ultimately led to the discovery of her half-brother. It's perfect, she said finally, her hand resting lightly on the fender. Absolutely perfect. Barrett excused himself tactfully, leaving them alone with the Packard. Mike opened the driver's door, inviting Elizabeth to sit behind the wheel. She slid onto the leather seat, her hands instinctively finding the right position on the steering wheel, as if some genetic memory had been passed down from Catherine. Mother loved driving this car, she said softly. The journals mentioned it so often, how free she felt behind the wheel, how the Packard responded to her touch like nothing else in her life. Mike nodded, understanding. Machines don't care about social status or expectations. They just respond to how you treat them, how well you understand their needs. Like people should, Elizabeth observed with a wry smile. But rarely do, Mike agreed. Elizabeth ran her fingers along the dashboard, the instruments all restored to perfect working order. What final adjustments remain? Just fine-tuning the carburetor and setting the timing precisely, Mike explained. I want it perfect before delivery. Joseph would accept nothing less. The mention of their biological father hung in the air between them, not uncomfortably, but with shared reverence for the man whose mechanical genius had brought them together across decades. When will it be ready for delivery? Elizabeth asked. Tomorrow, if today's adjustments go well, Mike replied. Barrett's team will transport it to the estate in their enclosed trailer. Elizabeth nodded, a strange expression crossing her face. Father has been asking about the timeline. He seems eager to have it back. That's surprising, Mike commented. I got the impression he viewed the Packard as a painful reminder. So did I, Elizabeth agreed. But lately he's been different, more reflective, less rigid. The legal agreement seems to have, I don't know, released something in him. Mike considered this. Since the signing 3 months ago, his direct contact with William Montgomery had been minimal. A brief phone consultation about the Packard's progress, a terse email exchange regarding some technical specifications. Nothing that suggested any fundamental change in the man's attitude. Have you discussed the Packard with him directly? Mike asked. Elizabeth nodded. He asked if we might drive it together when it's delivered. Said Mother would have wanted it to be used, not just displayed. The suggestion surprised Mike. William Montgomery taking a drive in Catherine's beloved Packard, the car she had shared with Joseph Foster, seemed oddly conciliatory from a man who had spent decades bearing that connection. Maybe the acknowledgement was more meaningful to him than he let on, Mike suggested. Perhaps admitting the truth, even privately, allowed him to begin making peace with it. Perhaps, Elizabeth agreed, though she sounded uncertain. He's a complicated man, my father, capable of both tremendous rigidity and surprising adaptability, sometimes in the same moment. They spent the afternoon making the final adjustments to the Packard's engine, working side by side with the easy synchronization they had developed over months of collaboration. Mike handled the technical aspects, adjusting the carburetor's air-fuel mixture, setting the ignition timing to the precise specifications Joseph had documented in his notes, while Elizabeth assisted handing him tools and learning the intricacies of the magnificent machine that connected them. By late afternoon, the work was complete. Mike started the Packard one final time, listening carefully to the perfect rumble of the V12 engine, watching the gauges for any hint of irregularity. The engine ran flawlessly, Joseph Foster's modifications, ensuring optimal performance despite the passage of half a century. She's ready, Mike announced, shutting down the engine and closing the hood with careful reverence. The Packard is completely restored, mechanically, cosmetically, in every way. Elizabeth smiled, a hint of sadness in her eyes. It feels like the end of something, doesn't it? Like we're closing a chapter. Or beginning a new one, Mike suggested. The Packard brought Joseph and Catherine together. It brought us together. Now it returns to the Montgomery estate, carrying all that history with it. Will you come tomorrow, Elizabeth asked, for the delivery? Mike hesitated. The legal agreement didn't specifically prohibit his presence at the estate for professional purposes, but he was conscious of not pushing boundaries too aggressively. Is your father expecting me? I told him you would want to oversee the unloading and make any final adjustments, Elizabeth said. He didn't object. Then I'll be there, Mike agreed. One last service to ensure the Packard arrives in perfect condition. They left Barrett's shop together, the Packard remaining behind for final detailing before transport. As they walked to their respective vehicles, Elizabeth suddenly stopped, turning to face Mike. They parted with a brief embrace, a gesture that had become natural over the months of their developing relationship. As Mike drove back toward Oak Ridge, he found himself reflecting on the journey that had begun with a Bentley's failing brakes and led to discoveries that had reshaped his understanding of his origins. Tomorrow, the Packard would return to the Montgomery estate fully restored in body and spirit. Whatever William Montgomery's reaction might be, the car now carried the truth within its steel and chrome, the undeniable evidence of Joseph Foster's mechanical genius and his connection to Catherine Montgomery, preserved despite decades of attempted erasure. The following morning dawned clear and mild, a perfect Texas autumn day for the Packards' homecoming. Mike arrived at the Montgomery estate just as Barrett's enclosed transport trailer was backing up to the garage complex. Elizabeth greeted him with a quick hug, her expression a mixture of excitement and nervousness. "Father's waiting in the garage," she said quietly. "He's been there since dawn, apparently making sure everything is prepared." Mike raised an eyebrow, surprised by this level of personal involvement from Montgomery. "How's his mood?" "Hard to read," Elizabeth admitted, "but not hostile, at least." They supervised the unloading process carefully, Barrett's team using a specialized ramp system to guide the Packard from the trailer without risking even the slightest damage to its immaculate finish. As the magnificent vehicle emerged into the sunlight, its silver paint gleaming like liquid mercury, a collective murmur of appreciation rose from everyone present. William Montgomery stood in the garage doorway watching the proceedings with an unreadable expression. He was dressed more casually than Mike had ever seen him. Khaki slacks, a light blue button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up, loafers rather than formal shoes. He looked less like a corporate titan and more like a man preparing to enjoy a classic automobile on a pleasant autumn day. When the Packard was safely on the ground, engine idling with perfect 12-cylinder smoothness, Barrett approached Montgomery with an extended hand. "Mr. Montgomery, she's ready for you, sir. Everything exactly as specified. Period correct in every detail, with all the mechanical modifications implemented precisely according to Mr. Foster's instructions." Montgomery shook Barrett's hand briefly. "The work appears exceptional. I'll have my assistant process the final payment today." As Barrett's team prepared to depart, Montgomery turned his attention to Mike for the first time. "Mr. Foster, I trust the mechanical systems are functioning to your satisfaction." "Yes, sir," Mike replied, keeping his tone professionally neutral. "The cooling system incorporates all of Joseph's modifications. The engine timing is set to his specifications, and all systems are operating optimally." Montgomery nodded, then surprised Mike by asking, "Would you demonstrate the engine's operation? I'd like to understand what makes these modifications so effective." The request was unexpected, a genuine interest in Joseph Foster's work, rather than the dismissal Mike had anticipated. "Of course," he agreed, moving to the Packard's engine compartment. For the next 15 minutes, Mike explained the intricacies of Joseph's cooling system design, the custom machined components, the innovative approach to heat distribution across the 12 cylinders. Montgomery listened attentively, occasionally asking surprisingly technical questions that revealed a deeper understanding of automotive engineering than Mike had credited him with. "Ingenious," Montgomery acknowledged when the explanation was complete. No wonder the specialists couldn't replicate it. They were looking for conventional solutions to what was in essence an unconventional problem. "Joseph never approached mechanics conventionally," Mike said, unable to keep a note of pride from his voice. "He believed every machine had its own personality, its own specific needs that might not fit standard procedures." Montgomery was quiet for a moment, studying the Packard with an expression Mike couldn't quite decipher. Finally, he turned to Elizabeth. "I believe you mentioned a drive once the car was delivered," he said. "The weather seems appropriate." Elizabeth nodded, a hint of surprise in her eyes. "Yes, I thought it would be good to ensure everything functions properly under actual driving conditions." "Indeed," Montgomery agreed. He hesitated, then added, "Perhaps Mr. Foster should accompany us, in case any mechanical adjustments are needed." The invitation stunned Mike. William Montgomery voluntarily suggesting his presence, proposing they share Catherine's beloved Packard for its first post-restoration drive. It was entirely unexpected. "I'd be happy to join you," Mike said carefully, "if you're sure that's what you want." Montgomery's expression remained neutral, but something in his eyes had softened almost imperceptibly. The Packard deserves to be experienced by those who understand its significance, its history. The acknowledgement, subtle as it was, felt monumental. Elizabeth moved quickly to accept before her father could reconsider. "Wonderful," she said. "I'll drive first if that's all right." Mother's journals mentioned how responsive the Packard was on winding roads. Montgomery nodded his agreement, and soon they were settled in the magnificent machine. Elizabeth behind the wheel, Montgomery in the passenger seat, Mike in the spacious rear compartment. The Packard purred to life with a touch of the starter, the V12 engine delivering its power with sophisticated restraint. As they drove through the estate grounds and out onto the country roads beyond, a strange peace seemed to settle over all three occupants. The Packard performed flawlessly, Joseph Foster's mechanical genius evident in every smooth acceleration, every effortless climb, every perfect response to Elizabeth's commands. They drove for nearly an hour, taking turns at the wheel, each experiencing the Packard in their own way. When Montgomery drove, his handling was precise but cautious, respecting the machine's age and significance. When Mike took his turn, he found himself driving as he imagined Joseph might have, with complete confidence in the engineering, pushing the Packard just enough to demonstrate its capabilities without stressing its restored components. Throughout it all, conversation remained minimal, limited mostly to observations about the car's performance. Yet the shared experience created its own form of communication. Three people connected by a complex history, finding common ground in their appreciation for a magnificent machine that had witnessed it all. As they returned to the estate, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the manicured grounds, Montgomery broke the comfortable silence. Catherine loved this car more than any possession she ever owned, he said, his voice carrying an unfamiliar note of nostalgia. Said it was the only thing in her life that responded honestly to how she treated it. The observation echoed so closely what Elizabeth had said the previous day that Mike wondered if Catherine had spoken those exact words to both husband and lover, a small, honest truth shared across the boundaries of her complicated life. She would be pleased to see it restored, Elizabeth said gently, especially with Joseph's modifications intact. Montgomery didn't respond immediately, his gaze fixed on the Packard's elegant hood ornament. When he finally spoke, his words surprised both Elizabeth and Mike. "Your mother was an extraordinary woman," he said quietly, "trapped in an ordinary marriage to a man who never fully understood her complexity. I recognized her unhappiness, but attributed it to dissatisfaction with society life, with the limitations of being a Montgomery wife. I never considered that she might simply have needed someone who saw her clearly, who valued her mind as much as her social position." The admission hung in the air, shocking in its vulnerability, from a man who had spent decades projecting nothing but strength and certainty. "Joseph saw her," Mike said, the words emerging before he could consider their wisdom. "His journal makes that clear. He valued her intelligence, her curiosity, her independent spirit." Rather than anger, Montgomery's response held a weary acceptance. "Yes, I believe he did." After a pause, he added, "Which is why I fought so hard to erase him from the narrative. Not just for my pride or reputation, but because acknowledging him meant acknowledging my own failure to be what Catherine needed." The confession stunned Mike into silence. Elizabeth reached across the seat, placing her hand briefly on her father's arm, a gesture of understanding, if not quite forgiveness. As they parked the Packard in its designated space in the garage, Montgomery turned to Mike one final time. "The car is perfect," he said simply. "Joseph would be proud of your work, as would Catherine." With that, he exited the vehicle and walked toward the main house, leaving Mike and Elizabeth beside the Packard, processing the unexpected moment of honesty from a man who had spent decades bearing the truth. "Did that just happen?" Mike asked quietly. Elizabeth nodded, equally astonished. "I've never heard him speak about Mother that way. Never heard him acknowledge any shortcoming in their relationship." "People can surprise you," Mike said, running his hand along the Packard's fender, "even after decades of predictable behavior." As they stood in contemplative silence, Mike realized the Packard had completed its mission, not just as a mechanical restoration, but as a catalyst for truth, for connection, for the tentative beginnings of healing across generations. Joseph Foster's modifications hadn't just made the engine run properly, they had created a vehicle for reconciliation that none of them could have anticipated. The Packard gleamed in the late afternoon light, its restoration complete in every sense. A perfect machine carrying within it the complex, imperfect, deeply human story of those who had loved it and each other across the decades. The invitation arrived on heavy cream-colored stationary Montgomery family crest embossed in the corner, the formal wording at odds with its unexpected content. "William Montgomery requests the pleasure of your company for the dedication of the Foster Montgomery Automotive Scholarship Fund. Saturday, November 12th, 2 o'clock, Montgomery Estate. Mike read it 3 times trying to process what it suggested. The Foster Montgomery Automotive Scholarship Fund was entirely new to him, and the idea of William Montgomery establishing something bearing both family names seemed impossible just months earlier. He called Elizabeth immediately. "Did you know about this?" he asked when she answered. "The scholarship fund, yes," she admitted. "Father has been working on it for several weeks, but he wanted to announce it himself. I take it you received the invitation." "Just now," Mike confirmed. "Elizabeth, what exactly is this about?" He heard her take a deep breath. After our drive into the Packard, Father started asking questions about Joseph. Not hostile interrogation, but genuine interest in his work, his approach to mechanics. "I shared some stories from your conversations with Tom Williams, described Joseph's reputation as a mechanical innovator." "And that led to a scholarship fund?" Mike asked, still confused. "Not immediately," Elizabeth explained, "but a few weeks ago, Father mentioned that true craftsmanship deserves recognition, that Joseph's mechanical genius was something worth preserving beyond just the Packard. He proposed establishing a scholarship for promising young mechanics from Oak Ridge and the surrounding communities." Mike sat down heavily trying to process this unexpected development. "And he named it Foster Montgomery." "His idea entirely," Elizabeth assured him. "I was as surprised as you are." "Who else is invited to this dedication?" "Small gathering," Elizabeth said. "You, me, Father Charles Webster, a representative from the community college where the scholarships will be awarded, and Tom Williams." Father specifically requested his presence as someone who knew Joseph professionally. The inclusion of Tom Williams seemed particularly significant, an acknowledgement of Joseph's professional legacy beyond just his connection to Catherine. It suggested Montgomery was genuinely trying to honor the man's work, not just making a symbolic gesture toward reconciliation. "Will you come?" Elizabeth asked when Mike remained silent. "Yes," he said finally. "Of course I'll come." The day of the dedication dawned clear and cool, a perfect mid-November afternoon. Mike arrived at the Montgomery estate feeling strangely nervous, unsure what to expect from this unprecedented event. He had dressed carefully. A charcoal suit, he rarely wore a crisp white shirt, no tie. Formal enough to show respect for the occasion, but still authentic to who he was. Elizabeth met him at the entrance, elegant, in a simple navy dress. "Thank you for coming," she said, embracing him briefly. "This means a lot to Father, though he'd never say so directly." "I'm still trying to understand what sparked this," Mike admitted, as they walked toward the rear gardens, where the dedication would take place. Elizabeth considered this. "I think the Packard changed something in him. Seeing Joseph's work, understanding the genius behind it, recognizing that Catherine had valued something real in him, it forced Father to confront his own narrative about their relationship. And the result is a scholarship fund, a way of acknowledging Joseph's contribution without directly confronting the personal aspects," Elizabeth suggested. "Father has always been more comfortable with professional recognition than emotional reconciliation." The garden had been arranged for the small ceremony. Chairs placed in a semicircle facing a podium, the Packard positioned prominently behind it, gleaming in the afternoon sun. Tom Williams was already seated, looking somewhat uncomfortable in a sport coat that had likely hung unworn in his closet for years. Charles Webster stood conversing quietly with a woman Mike didn't recognize, presumably the community college representative. William Montgomery himself stood beside the Packard, one hand resting lightly on his fender, his expression thoughtful. When he spotted Mike and Elizabeth approaching, he straightened, adjusting his suit jacket with habitual precision. "Mr. Foster," he said, extending his hand, "thank you for joining us today." Mike shook the offered hand, noting the firm grip, the direct eye contact, small gestures of respect that hadn't been present in their earlier interactions. "Thank you for the invitation, Mr. Montgomery. I confess, I'm curious about this scholarship fund." A hint of a smile touched Montgomery's lips. Elizabeth hasn't shared the details, uncharacteristic restraint on her part. "I thought you should present it yourself, Father," Elizabeth replied. Montgomery nodded, seeming almost pleased by her discretion. "We'll begin shortly. Please make yourself comfortable." The ceremony itself was brief but surprisingly meaningful. Montgomery spoke with uncharacteristic warmth about the importance of craftsmanship, of mechanical innovation, of preserving skills that modern technology often overlooked. He explained that the Foster Montgomery Automotive Scholarship would provide full tuition and tools to two promising students each year, young people demonstrating exceptional mechanical aptitude and innovative thinking. In establishing this fund, Montgomery said, his voice carrying clearly across the small gathering, "We honor the legacy of Joseph Foster, whose mechanical genius breathed life into machines others had dismissed as beyond repair." His approach to automotive restoration was not merely technical, but artistic, seeing potential where others saw only problems, creating solutions that were elegant in their simplicity and revolutionary in their effectiveness. Mike listened in amazement as William Montgomery, the man who had spent decades trying to erase Joseph Foster from history, now publicly praised his talent and innovation. It wasn't a full acknowledgement of their personal connection, but it was a meaningful recognition of Joseph's professional legacy. The recipients of this scholarship, Montgomery continued, will receive more than financial support. They will carry forward a tradition of excellence, of seeing beyond conventional solutions, of understanding that true mechanical mastery comes from listening to what machines tell us, not merely imposing textbook answers upon them. The community college representative spoke next, expressing gratitude for the generous endowment and explaining how recipients would be selected based on both technical aptitude and innovative thinking. The fund would cover not just tuition, but professional-grade tools, ensuring graduates could immediately apply their skills in professional settings. When the formal presentations concluded, Montgomery surprised everyone by inviting Tom Williams to speak. The elderly mechanic rose slowly, clearly unprepared for this role, but his words carried the authentic weight of someone who had witnessed Joseph Foster's work firsthand. "Joe Foster wasn't just good with it in hands," Williams said, his voice rough with age but clear with conviction. "He understood machines like most folks understand their own children. Knew what they needed, what they were trying to tell you when they weren't running right. He could listen to an engine and diagnose problems most mechanics wouldn't find with a computer." Williams glanced at the Packard, a smile creasing his weathered face. "That car there, Joe loved working on it. Said it had a personality, a spirit that deserved respect. He'd be mighty pleased to see it restored proper with all his modifications intact. And he'd be honored knowing his name was attached to helping young folks learn the right way to treat machines, not just fixing them, but understanding them." After the ceremony, as the small group enjoyed refreshments, Montgomery approached Mike privately. "A word if you don't mind," he said, gesturing toward a stone bench positioned beneath an ancient oak tree away from the others. They sat in an awkward silence for a moment, two men connected by complex circumstances neither had chosen. Finally, Montgomery spoke. "The scholarship fund is not meant as compensation or apology." He began, his tone direct but not confrontational. "It's recognition of genuine talent that deserves to be remembered, to be passed on to future generations." "I understand," Mike said, "and I appreciate it. Joseph would be honored." Montgomery nodded, his gaze fixed on the Packard in the distance. "I spent decades viewing him as a threat, an interloper. It was easier than acknowledging he might have offered Catherine something I couldn't." The admission clearly cost him, each word carefully measured, reluctantly released. "Working on the Packard," Montgomery continued, "seeing his modifications, understanding the innovation behind them, it forced me to recognize Joseph Foster as more than just the man who had an affair with my wife." He paused. "He was a genuine talent, someone Catherine would have recognized as a kindred spirit long before any personal involvement." Mike remained silent, sensing Montgomery needed to complete his thoughts without interruption. "I won't pretend to embrace our connection with open arms," Montgomery said finally. "Too many years of viewing it through a different lens. But I can acknowledge Joseph's professional legacy, ensure it continues through students who might otherwise lack the resources to develop similar talents." "That's more than I expected," Mike admitted honestly. "When I sought recognition of my parentage, I never anticipated anything beyond the legal acknowledgement." Montgomery's expression remained carefully composed, but something in his eyes had softened. "Elizabeth values your presence in her life. That fact alone requires me to find some measure of accommodation with our situation." It wasn't acceptance, not fully, but it was more than Montgomery had ever offered before, a recognition that their connection through Elizabeth was permanent, worthy of some form of respect, if not embrace. "The Packard brought Catherine and Joseph together," Mike observed, watching the magnificent machine gleam in the afternoon light. And now, in a way, it's brought their children together too. Montgomery considered this, his gaze following Mike's to the restored vehicle. Perhaps that's fitting. Catherine always said that car had a soul of its own, a purpose beyond mere transportation. Joseph believed the same, Mike said quietly. His journal mentioned it often, how certain machines transcend their mechanical nature, become vessels for human connection. A fleeting smile touched Montgomery's lips. On that, at least, they were in complete agreement. They sat in surprisingly comfortable silence for a moment, two men united by their connection to a remarkable woman and an equally remarkable machine. Finally, Montgomery rose, straightening his suit with habitual precision. The scholarship fund will announce its first recipients next spring, he said. I hope you will consider participating in the selection process. Your expertise would be valuable. The invitation unexpected, as it was represented another small step toward a relationship neither man had ever anticipated. I'd be honored, Mike replied sincerely. As they rejoined the others, Mike found Elizabeth watching them with hopeful curiosity. Everything all right? She asked quietly when Montgomery moved away to speak with the college representative. Better than all right, Mike assured her. Not perfect, probably never will be, but better than I ever expected. Elizabeth smiled genuine relief in her expression. He's trying in his own way. That's more than I thought possible 6 months ago. The Packard worked its magic, Mike suggested, only half joking. Perhaps, Elizabeth agreed, her gaze drifting to the magnificent machine that had connected their families across generations. Or perhaps it simply revealed what was always there beneath the surface, the possibility of understanding, of recognition, of shared appreciation for something greater than our individual narratives. As the afternoon drew to a close, guests departing one by one, Mike found himself alone with the Packard for a moment. He placed his hand on the fender, feeling the cool metal beneath his palm, imagining Joseph doing the same half a century earlier. Well done, old girl, he murmured. Mission accomplished. The Packard gleamed in response, 12 cylinders at rest, but still radiating the quiet dignity of a machine that had witnessed history, carried secrets, and ultimately helped heal wounds decades in the making. 6 months after the scholarship dedication, Mike stood in the empty warehouse on the outskirts of Oak Ridge, measuring tape in hand, sketching potential layouts on a clipboard. The cavernous space echoed with his footsteps as he moved from one end to the other, envisioning what it could become. The building had been vacant for years, a former manufacturing facility that had closed when operations moved overseas. High ceilings, concrete floors, abundant natural light from clerestory windows, and enough square footage to accommodate his ambitious plans. His phone rang, interrupting his calculations. Elizabeth's name appeared on the screen. Just checking on warehouse viewing number 4, she said when he answered. Better than the others. Much better, Mike confirmed. Good bones, plenty of space, reasonable distance from both Oak Ridge and Austin. Power service needs upgrading, but the structure itself is solid. Excellent, Elizabeth replied, satisfaction evident in her voice. What's your gut feeling? Is this the one? Mike surveyed the space again, mentally placing equipment, work areas, classroom space. Yes, he said decisively. This is it. I'll have the real estate agent prepare an offer, Elizabeth said. Corporate or personal purchase. The question referenced their ongoing discussion about how to structure their new venture, the Foster Montgomery Restoration Institute, a training facility designed to teach young mechanics the dying art of classic vehicle restoration. Personal, Mike decided. Keeps it simpler for now. We can always restructure later if needed. The institute had begun as a casual conversation after the scholarship dedication with Elizabeth, suggesting that a training program would complement the scholarship fund perfectly. What if promising students could learn not just modern automotive technology at the community college, but classic restoration techniques from experienced craftspeople? The idea had quickly evolved into a concrete plan, a dedicated facility where Mike and other master mechanics could teach hands-on restoration skills, preserving techniques that were rapidly disappearing in the age of computerized diagnostics and disposable components. William Montgomery surprisingly had endorsed the concept, offering to connect them with potential donors from his extensive network of classic car enthusiasts. While he remained somewhat reserved in his personal interactions with Mike, he had become an unexpected ally in their professional endeavors. 2 weeks later, the warehouse purchase complete, Mike supervised the installation of the first equipment. Hydraulic lifts, a machine shop specialized tools for bodywork and engine rebuilding. Elizabeth managed the business aspects, securing necessary permits, developing marketing materials, and establishing relationships with the community college to create a pipeline for promising students. On a warm spring afternoon, as Mike was installing a vintage lathe rescued from a closing machine shop, a familiar vehicle pulled into the gravel parking lot outside. The Packard, its silver paint gleaming in the sunlight, engine purring with 12-cylinder perfection. William Montgomery emerged from the driver's seat, looking slightly out of place in his tailored clothes amid the industrial setting. He approached the open warehouse door with measured steps, taking in the transformation already underway. "Mr. Foster," he called, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. "Elizabeth mentioned you'd acquired a suitable location." Mike wiped his hands on a shop rag, surprised by the unexpected visit. "Mr. Montgomery, yes, we closed on the property 2 weeks ago. Renovations are proceeding well." Montgomery nodded, surveying the space with a businessman's calculating eye. "Ambitious project." "It needs to be, i.e.," Mike replied. "These skills are disappearing. Another generation without deliberate preservation, and much of this craftsmanship will be lost entirely." "Indeed," Montgomery agreed, running his hand along a partially restored fender mounted on a workstand. "That would be regrettable." He moved further into the space, examining the equipment being installed, the areas marked out for different aspects of restoration training. His expression remained neutral, but Mike detected genuine interest in his careful inspection. "Elizabeth mentioned you're targeting a fall opening," Montgomery said finally. "That's the plan," Mike confirmed. "Limited enrollment the first year, maybe a dozen students. Quality over quantity?" Montgomery nodded approvingly. "Wise approach." He hesitated, then added, "I've taken the liberty of mentioning your institute to several colleagues who maintain significant collections. There's considerable interest in supporting this type of traditional skills preservation." The offer of connection to potential donors was unexpected, but welcome. "We'd appreciate any introductions you're willing to make," Mike said. "The facility costs are covered, but scholarships for students who can't afford the tuition would be valuable." "I'll arrange meetings," Montgomery promised. "These individuals understand the value of craftsmanship. They'll support the right approach." As they continued discussing the Institute's development, Mike was struck by how their relationship had evolved. From hostile antagonists to cautious collaborators united by a shared appreciation for mechanical craftsmanship. They would never be close, never have the easy familiarity of true family, but they had found common ground in honoring Joseph Foster's legacy through education. When Elizabeth arrived an hour later, she found them in deep discussion about vintage machine tools, Montgomery offering surprisingly knowledgeable suggestions about equipment that might enhance the training program. "This is unexpected," she murmured to Mike when Montgomery stepped away to examine the newly installed hydraulic lift. "Pleasant surprise," Mike agreed. "Your father knows more about restoration equipment than I would have guessed." "He restored vintage radios in college," Elizabeth explained, "before business became all-consuming. Mother mentioned it in her journals, said it was one of the few genuinely passionate interests he abandoned for the sake of appearances." The revelation added another layer to Mike's evolving understanding of William Montgomery. Not just a corporate titan determined to protect his reputation, but a complex man who had made his own sacrifices to expectation and propriety. Over the following months, the Foster Montgomery Restoration Institute took shape. The warehouse transformed into a state-of-the-art training facility with dedicated areas for engine rebuilding, body restoration, upholstery work, and mechanical diagnostics. Vintage tools were supplemented by modern equipment where appropriate, creating an environment that honored traditional craftsmanship while acknowledging contemporary techniques. The first class of students was selected from an unexpectedly large pool of applicants, people of all ages drawn to the idea of preserving automotive history through hands-on restoration. Some came from the community college's automotive program, others from established repair shops seeking to expand their skills, and a few directly from high schools, where mechanical aptitude had been recognized but not fully developed. On opening day, Mike stood before the assembled students, instructors, and supporters, including Elizabeth, and somewhat surprisingly, William Montgomery. The Packard had been positioned prominently near the entrance, a tangible example of what skilled restoration could achieve. "Welcome to the Foster Montgomery Restoration Institute," Mike began, his voice carrying clearly through the renovated space. "This facility exists for one purpose: to ensure that the craftsmanship, the problem-solving approaches, and the mechanical intuition of previous generations isn't lost as we move further into the digital age. He gestured toward the Packard. That vehicle represents more than just a successful restoration. It embodies a philosophy that understanding how things truly work at a fundamental level is valuable regardless of technological advancement. That machines respond to those who listen to them, who respect their design, while recognizing when innovation is needed. As he spoke, Mike caught Elizabeth's proud smile, the approving nod from Tom Williams, who had agreed to teach occasional master classes, and even a hint of satisfaction in William Montgomery's usually guarded expression. The skills you'll learn here aren't just about restoring old cars, Mike continued. They're about understanding systems, developing patience, honoring craftsmanship, and solving problems with both your hands and your mind. Whether you ultimately work on classic vehicles or apply these approaches to entirely different fields, the foundational skills of careful observation, systematic diagnosis, and creative solution finding will serve you well. After the formal opening ceremony, as students explored the facility with their new instructors, Elizabeth joined Mike beside the Packard. "Joseph would be proud," she said quietly. "This is the perfect tribute to his legacy." "Catherine, too," Mike added. "From what I've learned about her through the journals, she valued craftsmanship, authenticity, things built to last." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the activity around them. Young people eagerly examining tools and equipment, experienced instructors demonstrating techniques, the beginning of knowledge transmission that would ensure these skills survived for another generation. "I never expected this outcome," Mike admitted. "When I first identified Joseph's modifications to the Packard, I was just trying to solve a mechanical puzzle. I never imagined it would lead to—" He gestured around them. "All of this." "Life rarely follows the expected path," Elizabeth observed, "especially when Packards and Fosters and Montgomerys are involved." As the day progressed, Mike found himself frequently returning to the Packard, drawn to the machine that had set everything in motion. Its elegant lines, its magnificent 12-cylinder engine, its perfect proportions, all spoke of an era when automobiles were more than transportation. They were expressions of artistry and engineering excellence. But beyond its mechanical perfection, the Packard now carried additional significance. As the physical embodiment of connections across time, across social boundaries, across the artificial divisions humans created between themselves. It had brought Catherine and Joseph together decades ago, then brought their children together half a century later, and now served as inspiration for a new generation of craftspeople who would carry forward their shared legacy. In its chrome and steel, in its carefully preserved modifications, in its quiet dignity, the Packard testified to an essential truth that what we create with passion and skill endures beyond us, connecting past to future in ways we might never anticipate. As Mike ran his hand along the Packard's fender, he felt a sense of completion. Not an ending, but a circle closed, a new beginning, established a legacy honored and extended into the future. Joseph and Catherine's story hadn't ended with separation and secrecy. It continued through their children, through the Institute, through every student who would learn to approach machines with the same respect and ingenuity that Joseph Foster had demonstrated throughout his life. The Packard gleamed in response, 12 cylinders at rest, but ready to roar to life again whenever called upon. A mechanical testament to craftsmanship, preserved connections honored, and futures built upon the solid foundations of the past.